Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where the underworld never sleeps. Tonight, we descend into the life of one of America's coldest killers, a man who could smile over dinner with his family and take a life before dessert. His name was Richard Kuklinski, the Mafia's invisible executioner, better known as the Iceman. He didn't kill for rage or money alone. He killed because silence was his kingdom and death was his craft. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing our little crime family grow across countries and time zones. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another dive into the dark world of Outlaw Icons. Now dim the lights, because tonight, we're stepping into the frozen heart of America's most feared hitman, Richard the Iceman Kuklinski. Chapter 1. The Cold Shadow of Killer. He sat there in a dim prison room, a heavy man with eyes that could freeze a heartbeat. The camera light flickered against his face as he leaned forward, speaking softly, almost kindly. "He disrespected me," he said, his voice calm, steady, without a tremor. "So, I shot him, right in the head. Then I went home, had dinner. There was no music, no dramatics. Just the sound of a man confessing to murder, like he was talking about fixing a leaky faucet." Richard Kuklinski didn't brag. He didn't boast. He told stories the way a butcher describes cuts of meat, detached, methodical, and matter of fact. And that calmness was far more terrifying than rage could ever be. When the interviewer asked how it felt to kill, Kuklinski shrugged. It felt like nothing. Then he smiled. A small, polite smile, the kind you give a stranger holding an elevator door. That smile said everything. It wasn't about hate or greed or revenge. It was about power. The power to end something, instantly, and then walk away like it never happened. He was called the Iceman because he froze the bodies of his victims to disguise the time of death. But the truth ran deeper. The nickname fit because his soul itself seemed frozen solid. Long before he became the Mafia's most reliable executioner, before he was an urban legend whispered in criminal circles, Richard Kuklinski was just another face in suburban New Jersey. He had a family, a house, kids who played in the yard, and neighbors who waved at him every morning. They thought he was a businessman, maybe a trucker or warehouse supplier. No one questioned why he left at odd hours, or why his eyes seemed to drift when small talk began. He was the man next door, polite, quiet, invisible. But behind that calm suburban mask lived something far colder. When he kissed his children goodnight, his hands were steady, the same hands that once held a gun against a man's temple. His wife Barbara saw the temper, the outbursts, the unpredictable storms of silence that followed. But even she never imagined the scale of the darkness he carried. Richard could go from gentle to monstrous in the space of a breath. He was two men living inside one body, the family man and the executioner. And he built walls so thick between them that even he began to believe they were separate people. He wasn't born into the Mafia. He wasn't even born into crime. He was born into pain. Jersey City, 1935, a world of tenements, factory smoke, and cold winters that seeped into the bones. His father, Stanley, was a violent man who drank too much and hit too hard. His mother, Anna, was a devout Catholic who wielded her religion like a weapon, beating her son with broom handles and reciting prayers as he cried. Violence was the family language. Richard learned early that the only safe emotion was silence. When his brother Florian died from one of his father's beatings, Richard didn't cry. He watched the adults panic, heard the whispers, and realized something powerful. In this world, emotion was weakness. Control was survival. That moment was the first seed of the Iceman. He buried his fear so deep it hardened into something else. As a teenager, he was quiet but volatile, a kid others teased until they realized how far he would go to make it stop. One local bully pushed too far, and Richard decided to teach him a lesson. He followed him, cornered him, and beat him with a wooden rod until the boy stopped moving. He didn't stop out of fear or mercy. He stopped because the boy wasn't breathing. And in that instant, he discovered something terrifying. Not guilt, not horror, but relief. For the first time in his life, he felt in control. From that moment, killing became his way of reclaiming power from a world that had beaten it out of him. He learned that death could be silent, and control could be addictive. The streets of Jersey City became his testing ground. When he wasn't working menial jobs, he was experimenting, sometimes on stray animals, sometimes on men who had crossed him. The police didn't notice. No one did, because Richard Kuklinski was invisible. He moved like fog, present but unnoticed, always there but never remembered. In his 20s, he drifted toward petty crime, theft, bootlegging, whatever made money. But his true talent wasn't stealing. It was removing obstacles. The Mafia noticed that kind of talent. By the late 1950s, he was introduced to the DeCavalcante crime family, Jersey's answer to the bigger New York syndicates. They liked that he was quiet, efficient, and untraceable. He didn't talk, didn't drink, didn't draw attention. Soon he was taking contracts, small at first, then larger. And once he started, he never stopped. Every killing was different, but his process was the same. He studied his targets, watched their routines, waited for the perfect moment. Sometimes he used guns, sometimes knives, sometimes cyanide, a poison he described as clean and efficient. If he needed to make a body disappear, he used acid or deep freezing. Each kill was a test of precision, like tightening the bolts on a machine. No chaos, no mess, just results. He became useful to several crime families, the Gambinos, the Genovese, even freelance jobs for the Lucchese's. But Kuklinski wasn't like other hitmen. He wasn't loyal to anyone but himself. He treated murder as a business transaction. If you paid, he delivered. It didn't matter who the target was. It didn't matter why. He could kill a rival mobster in the morning and take his kids to the movies that evening. That kind of compartmentalization is rare, almost inhuman. But for Richard, it was survival. At home, he was the image of stability. His wife Barbara remembered him as protective, charming even in the beginning. He brought gifts, flowers, promises. But slowly, control began to seep in. He wanted to dictate what she wore, who she spoke to, how she behaved. When she resisted, he erupted. His rage wasn't loud. It was explosive and unpredictable, like a power line snapping in the dark. She would see the flicker in his eyes before it came. The cold stillness that warned something terrible was about to happen. Yet after every outburst came remorse. The tears, the apologies, the promises that he'd never lose control again. And for a while, she believed him. Because every monster, no matter how brutal, knows how to mimic love. The violence behind closed doors mirrored the violence of his contracts. Each world feeding the other. Each secret buried deeper beneath the surface of his ordinary life. His children adored him. He built snowmen with them in the yard, took them for drives, told them stories about his business trips. They never suspected that the briefcase in his trunk sometimes carried weapons, or that the nights he came home late were spent disposing of bodies. They just saw a father who worked hard, a man who provided. But cracks began to show. Little things. The way he'd disappear for hours with no explanation. The strange smell on his clothes. The distant look in his eyes, as if he was somewhere else entirely. His wife noticed, but fear kept her quiet. You don't confront a man who can change from gentle to deadly in a single heartbeat. By the 1970s, Kuklinski had become a legend in the underworld. The man who never got caught. The man who made problems vanish. They said he'd killed over 100 people, maybe more. The exact number was lost to time, and probably to truth itself. He never kept records. He didn't need to. The Mafia trusted him because he didn't talk. His silence was his weapon. His reliability made him untouchable. Cops knew there was someone out there, a ghost connecting dozens of unsolved murders across New York and New Jersey. Bodies turning up with no clear link, deaths ruled as accidents, suicides, or vanishings. They called it coincidence. He called it efficiency. To the world, Richard Kuklinski was a family man with a steady income. To the underworld, he was death on call. In interviews years later, when asked if he felt remorse, He would tilt his head and say, "Why should I? They would have killed me if I didn't kill them first." It wasn't entirely true, but it was how he justified it. Every killer needs a reason, even if it's a lie they tell themselves to keep the nightmares quiet. For Richard, that lie was survival. He wasn't evil, he said. He was just doing what needed to be done. What made him terrifying wasn't just what he did, but how he did it. He could kill without emotion, then eat a sandwich afterward. He could sit through a family dinner, laughing, while recalling the face of the man he had strangled that morning. His heart rate never spiked. His breathing never changed. In his mind, killing was no different from clocking in at work. It was simply part of the job. He became known as the Iceman for how he preserved bodies, freezing them to confuse police about the time of death. It wasn't just clever, it was artful in its cruelty. He once stored a body for 2 years before dumping it, just to prove a point. That body, when thawed, looked freshly killed, baffling investigators. Richard took pride in that kind of mastery. To him, it was proof that he was smarter than everyone else, smarter than cops, smarter than mobsters, smarter than fate itself. But that kind of pride doesn't last. No man can live 2 lives forever. One world always bleeds into the other. By the early 80s, he was beginning to slip. He trusted the wrong people. He grew careless. His ego told him he was untouchable. But paranoia was creeping in. He started seeing betrayal everywhere. In his partners, in his friends, even in his wife. The same fear that once made him powerful was now eating him alive. Still, he held the illusion together. To his family, he was a hard-working husband. To the Mafia, he was a ghost who never missed a target. But under the surface, the walls were cracking. His methods were changing, becoming sloppier, more violent. He was no longer killing with precision. He was killing with anger. And that change, though subtle, would be his undoing. When you watch him speak in those old prison tapes, it's chilling not because of what he says, but because of what he doesn't. He pauses between words, as if measuring how much of his soul to reveal. You can almost see the boy he used to be, beaten, humiliated, made to feel worthless, hiding behind the calm exterior of a man who decided he'd never be powerless again. Killing became his way of proving that. He once said, "We're all capable of it. You, me, anyone. The difference is I just never cared." Maybe that's true. Or maybe caring was something that got beaten out of him long ago. Either way, his coldness was his armor. And that armor made him untouchable until it didn't. By the time law enforcement finally closed in, they weren't just hunting a killer. They were unraveling a myth. A man who had lived 2 parallel lives for nearly 3 decades. A husband who tucked his kids into bed, and a murderer who left bodies in freezers. A ghost who walked among them unnoticed. And as the camera fades on that first interview, that cold smile, that calm confession, the question still lingers in the silence he leaves behind. How does a man live for 30 years between love and death and never once lose sleep? The answer begins to take shape in the years ahead, as the cracks in the ice finally begin to spread. Chapter 2: Childhood of Violence. Before the monster, there was a boy. Not born evil, not destined for blood. Just a quiet child trying to survive in a home where love was twisted into fear. The house on 3rd Street in Jersey City looked ordinary from the outside, with peeling paint and a thin garden that never grew anything. But inside, it was a war zone. Every room held its own ghosts, and every night, a new wound was carved into memory. Richard Kuklinski's earliest sounds were the crack of a belt and the silence that followed. His father, Stanley, a Polish immigrant and a railroad worker, carried rage like others carried lunch pails. He was tall, heavy, with a face always red from drink, and when he came home, the children hid. Sometimes he'd hit Richard for a bad grade, sometimes for a look, sometimes for no reason at all. The strikes came fast and without warning, leaving bruises that spoke louder than words. His mother, Anna, was no savior. A devout Catholic, she believed pain could purify sin. When Stanley beat the children bloody, she cleaned them up, then beat them again for making their father angry. Between them, Richard learned 2 things: that love hurts and silence keeps you alive. He was the middle child, the one who watched and waited. His older brother Florian was smaller, weaker, the one who couldn't take the blows. Richard saw it happen, saw Stanley beat Florian until his small body went limp. They said it was an accident, a fall down the stairs. But even as a boy, Richard knew better. His brother's death became the unspoken shadow in the house. The family never spoke his name again. But Richard did. In his mind, every time his father raised a hand, every time his mother whispered prayers over the welts on his back, that death taught him something crucial. Pain meant nothing. Life could vanish in a moment, and no one cared. He carried that truth with him into the streets. School was another battlefield. Kids laughed at his shabby clothes, his stutter, his strange quietness. They called him names, pushed him, tested him. He took it all until one day he didn't. One boy in particular, a loudmouth kid who thought Richard was easy prey, found out what silence can become when it breaks. Richard followed him after school, cornered him in an alley, and beat him until the laughter stopped. He kept hitting, long after the boy stopped fighting back. When it was over, the street was still, and Richard's hands were slick with something warm. He didn't feel fear. He didn't feel guilt. What he felt was peace, power, the chaos in his home, the helplessness he'd lived under. All of it vanished in that single act. When he got home, he washed his hands and ate dinner. No one noticed anything different, but inside, something had changed forever. He had learned how to make the world quiet. He began to experiment with violence the way others experiment with hobbies. He hurt animals first, not out of cruelty, but curiosity. How far could he go? How much control could he have before life slipped away? It wasn't joy he felt, but fascination. He wasn't the kind of killer who smiled at suffering. He was the kind who studied it, measured it, learned from it. Killing became a kind of science to him. Cause, effect, consequence. And in a house where love and pain were inseparable, it made a twisted kind of sense. The years rolled on, and the city changed, but the Kuklinski home stayed the same. Cold, oppressive, unforgiving. His father's drinking grew worse. His mother's faith grew harder. When she wasn't working in the meatpacking plant, she was at church, lighting candles for sins she couldn't confess. Richard watched her kneel and pray for forgiveness she'd never receive. It confused him, how someone could ask for mercy after inflicting so much harm. It was his first real lesson in hypocrisy. The world, he realized, was full of people pretending to be good while doing terrible things. By the time he reached his late teens, Richard had become invisible. He moved through life like a ghost, tall, quiet, unreadable. He had no friends, no hobbies, no dreams. He dropped out of school and drifted between jobs, doing whatever paid cash. Loading docks, delivery runs, janitorial work. People forgot him as soon as they met him, and that anonymity became his greatest weapon later in life. He didn't crave attention. He craved control, and the streets gave him plenty of chances to practice it. Jersey City in the 1950s was a tough place. Industrial smoke hung low over the rooftops, and the docks buzzed with hustlers, thieves, and loan sharks. Violence wasn't shocking. It was routine. The mafia was woven into every corner of daily life. Everyone knew someone connected, and everyone owed someone something. Richard wasn't part of that world yet, but he was watching. He saw the way men with power carried themselves, how respect came from fear, not kindness. They didn't shout. They didn't fight in the open. They gave a look, and people moved out of their way. That quiet power fascinated him. He started running errands for small-time crooks. Nothing major, moving stolen goods, roughing up someone who didn't pay a debt, collecting for bookmakers. He was reliable, efficient, and most importantly, unflinching. He never lost his temper on a job, never bragged, never asked questions. That calmness caught attention. Soon, older guys started testing him, offering him jobs that needed someone with no conscience and no curiosity. He took them all. There was one job that defined his reputation early on. A local hustler named Charlie owed money to a small crew. They wanted to send a message, nothing fatal, a beating, maybe a broken arm. But Richard went too far. When he showed up, he didn't talk, didn't warn. He pulled a pipe from under his coat and hit Charlie once hard. The sound was like a hammer striking wet clay. Charlie dropped, his head open. Richard froze for a moment, then walked away, calm as if he'd finished sweeping a floor. Later, when the crew found out, they expected panic. But Richard didn't flinch. He had it coming, he said. They looked at each other and saw something valuable. A man who didn't need reasons. From that day on, he was no longer just another street thug. He was the guy they called when something needed to disappear. Back home, the double life began. He met Barbara Pedersey, a receptionist at a trucking company, and for the first time, he tried to play the part of a normal man. She was drawn to his quiet confidence, the way he made her feel safe. He brought flowers, opened doors, promised stability. She had no idea that the same hands holding hers had ended lives. To her, he was gentle, attentive, protective. That charm, that calm exterior, it wasn't fake. It was another part of him, just as real as the violence. Two sides of the same coin, and he flipped it whenever he needed to. But old habits don't die easily. Every time he smiled, a darker part of him waited just behind it. The temper came out in flashes, small things that didn't make sense. A burnt meal, a minor disagreement, a wrong word. His eyes would go flat, his voice would drop, and suddenly the air in the room would change. He didn't yell often, but when he did, it came from somewhere deep and dangerous. Barbara learned to read the signs, to stay quiet, to survive the storms. Still, she stayed. Because every monster knows how to disguise itself as a man who promises never to hurt you again. He married her, moved her into a small house in Dumont, and started a family. On the surface, life looked normal. Barbecues, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. Beneath it, Richard was building a criminal career that would soon make him one of the most feared men on the East Coast. But the roots of that power, the calm precision that made him unstoppable, came from these early years, from a boy who learned that love and pain were the same language. Sometimes, when he spoke about his childhood in interviews decades later, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not regret, not emotion, but recognition. "My father made me what I am," he said once. "He beat the fear out of me. Maybe too much." It wasn't a confession. It was an explanation. The Iceman didn't appear out of nowhere. He was built, one bruise at a time, in a house where no one said sorry. Psychologists later tried to label him sociopath, psychopath, antisocial personality disorder. All true maybe, but those words don't capture what really happened. What shaped him wasn't just abuse. It was the normalization of cruelty. When you grow up believing violence is ordinary, it stops feeling like evil. It becomes a tool, a response, a solution. That's what made Kuklinski different from other killers. He didn't see death as moral or immoral. He saw it as practical. By his 20s, that practicality made him dangerous. He no longer reacted emotionally. He calculated. If someone insulted him, he didn't explode. He waited. He studied them, chose the right place, the right time. Killing became a form of problem solving. And each time he got away with it, the confidence grew. He started to believe he was untouchable. He once said he felt invisible. It wasn't pride, it was truth. He could walk down a street after a murder, past police officers, and none of them looked twice. He dressed plain, spoke little, never bragged. His normalcy was his camouflage, and it worked. While other men drew attention with flash and fury, Richard melted into the background. The perfect predator in plain sight. Meanwhile, at home, Barbara's reality was fracturing. She had married a man who brought home steady money, but never said where it came from. When she asked, he told her to trust him. When she pressed, he changed, eyes narrowing, voice turning cold. She learned to stop asking. Sometimes he came home with blood on his clothes. "Car trouble," he'd say. She'd nod, clean the stains, and pretend not to see. Neighbors thought they were the perfect family. Richard mowed lawns, attended church, helped fix broken fences. But in private, the walls heard everything. The shouting, the fear, the apologies that came too late. One moment he'd cradle her face. The next, he'd choke her against the wall. Then he'd break down, sobbing, swearing it would never happen again. The cycle repeated, over and over, tightening like a noose. And through it all, his reputation on the streets grew. The quiet man from Jersey was becoming a ghost story. The guy who could kill without blinking, who never got caught, who never left a trace. Some said he kept bodies in freezers, others that he fed them to rats. Most of it was myth. But myths start from truth. And the truth was simple. He was ruthless, efficient, and utterly without fear. When he wasn't working for small crews, he was freelancing. Word spread to New York. The Mafia, the real power, began to notice. The DeCavalcante family, and later the Gambinos, saw value in a man like him. A man who didn't ask questions, who didn't talk, who finished the job clean. They started giving him real work. Hits, collections, disappearances. And he took to it like he was born for it. Yet in the quiet moments, something else stirred. The ghost of his childhood never really left. Sometimes he'd dream of his father, that red face, that heavy belt, and wake up drenched in sweat. Other nights, he'd stare at his sleeping children and wonder if they'd grow up to hate him. But morning always came, and with it, the armor slid back on. The emotions faded, the silence returned, and the Iceman went back to work. If you look closely at those old interviews, you can almost see the flicker of that child behind his adult calm. The boy who wanted to be seen, who learned instead to disappear. Every time he speaks about his father, there's a pause, a twitch, a shadow that crosses his expression. He was a tough man, he'd say softly, but I was tougher. And maybe he was. But toughness built on trauma has a cost. Every scar, every body, every lie he told his family was another brick in the wall he built to keep his past from reaching him. What he didn't realize was that the wall wasn't keeping the world out. It was keeping the darkness in. By the end of his 20s, the transformation was complete. The quiet boy from Jersey City was gone. In his place stood a man who felt nothing, feared nothing, and trusted no one. A man who had learned that silence was deadlier than a gun. He had become what his father had unknowingly created, a living weapon. And in the shadows of that new life, the Mafia was waiting, ready to give him purpose, ready to turn that weapon loose on the world. The boy who once hid from the sound of a belt was about to become the man every criminal in New York would learn to fear. And in the distance, though he didn't know it yet, his next victim was already breathing the last free air they'd ever taste. Chapter 3, The First Kill. It began, as many of his stories did, with silence. No premeditation, no grand reason, just a moment when the world pushed too far, and something inside him snapped. Richard Kuklinski never planned his first kill. It came out of the kind of anger that brews over years, the kind that simmers beneath bruises and prayers, waiting for the smallest spark. He was 18 then, working part-time at a warehouse, keeping mostly to himself. The men there teased him for his quietness, for the way he avoided eye contact. They thought he was soft. One man in particular, Charlie Lane, made it his mission to humiliate him. Day after day, the taunts grew louder, sharper, like knives scratching the same wound. It was late one night, after another insult, that Richard decided he'd had enough. He waited outside the bar, where Charlie drank. The street was empty, cold, the kind of cold that bites the skin and makes breath look like smoke. He didn't shout, didn't warn him. He just walked up, pulled a steel bar from his coat, and swung once. The sound was hollow, final. Charlie fell, his eyes wide in disbelief, his body crumpling to the ground. Richard hit him again, and again. He didn't stop until the anger was gone, until the silence inside him was perfect again. He stood over the body for a moment, breathing slowly, the world strangely still. Then he dragged it behind a dumpster and walked home. He washed his hands, ate dinner, slept soundly. The next morning, the city went on as if nothing had happened. A man was missing, but men went missing all the time. And for Richard, life felt lighter, calmer. It was as if a pressure he'd carried his whole life had been released. That first kill wasn't about hate. It was about control. The first time he felt completely free from fear. It became the foundation for everything that came after. When he spoke about it years later, there was no pride, no guilt, just matter-of-fact recollection. He disrespected me, he said, so I took care of it. Simple words. Terrifying logic. After that, something inside him shifted permanently. Violence no longer felt chaotic. It felt like order. The world made sense when he was in control, when he decided who lived and who didn't. The helpless boy beaten by his father was gone. In his place stood a young man who understood power in its rawest form, the power to take life and feel nothing. He began testing boundaries. Small things at first, picking fights with men twice his size, just to see how far they go before fear replaced bravado. When he realized they always backed down, he grew bolder. He started hanging around pool halls and backrooms, places where danger was currency. He didn't drink or joke like the others. He just watched, observed, the way a man's eyes darted before lying, the nervous twitch of a hand reaching for a weapon. He studied people the way a mechanic studies an engine, learning which part breaks first under pressure. His reputation grew quietly. The quiet kid with the dead stare. The one who didn't talk much, but handled things when necessary. He became useful to small-time crooks who needed muscle without the noise. If someone owed money or caused trouble, Richard was the one they sent. He wasn't fast or flashy. He was efficient. He'd show up, deliver pain, and leave without a word. There was no drama, no chaos, just results. One night, after roughing up a man for a gambling debt, he was approached by a figure who would change his path entirely. A local enforcer connected to the DeCavalcante family. He'd been watching Richard for weeks, curious about his calmness under pressure. "You don't scare easy," the man said. "That's good. Fear gets men killed." Richard didn't respond. He just nodded, and that was enough. Soon he was introduced to a new world. A world that operated by its own rules, where silence was currency and fear was business. The Mafia didn't recruit openly, but they recognized potential when they saw it. Richard's lack of emotion, his ability to act without hesitation, made him valuable. They started small, collection jobs, threats, intimidation. But even then, his method stood out. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. He just did what needed to be done. When asked how he kept so calm, he'd say, "Why get excited? The outcome's the same." That kind of logic unsettled, even hardened men. To them, violence was passion. To Richard, it was maintenance, a way to keep the world in balance. But while his career was forming in the shadows, his home life told another story. He was married now, with Barbara, trying to build something normal. He wanted the American dream. A house, kids, stability. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could control everything except himself. The violence that once kept him safe began to spill over. When he felt disrespected at home, that same coldness took over. The same precision he used on the streets found its way into his marriage. He didn't see it as abuse. He saw it as correction, the same twisted logic his parents had used on him. Barbara learned early how to navigate the moods, how to defuse the quiet tension that built behind his eyes. She never fully knew what he did for work, and she didn't want to. He was vague about money, sometimes disappearing for days. When he came back, there was always cash, always calmness, until something minor disturbed it again. On the streets, he was climbing. The DeCavalcante crew started trusting him with harder jobs, jobs where someone needed to vanish. The first time they asked him to kill for money, he didn't hesitate. He'd already proven to himself he could do it. This time, he'd just get paid. It was a rival bookie who'd been undercutting business. They gave Richard an address, a time, a description. No questions. He went alone, parked a block away, and waited. When a man appeared, he approached from behind and fired once. Clean. Quick. The man dropped, groceries spilling across the pavement. Richard walked away. The sound barely echoed. Later, when he collected his payment, the envelope was thick with cash. He opened it, counted it slowly, then tucked it into his jacket. No celebration. No guilt. Just a job done well. That was the beginning of his career as a professional killer. Word spread quietly among the circles that mattered. There was a man in Jersey who got things done. No fuss, no mess, no talk. They called him the Polak at first, then later, simply Rich. The nickname, Iceman, wouldn't come for years, but the coldness was already there. Each kill made him more confident, more methodical. He experimented with weapons, techniques, timing. Guns were fast but noisy. Knives required closeness, but he didn't mind that. It gave him control. Cyanide became his favorite later. Tasteless, efficient, almost artistic in its precision. But in these early years, he relied on brute force. The same hands that once built model airplanes now broke necks with ease. The duality of his life fascinated even him. By day, he played with his daughters, mowed the lawn, smiled for photos. By night, he became a ghost. He'd drive through dark streets with a body in his trunk, humming softly to the radio. To him, they were just different shifts of the same job, providing for his family by taking from others. He once said, "It wasn't personal. It was business, just like killing time." The phrase captures mindset perfectly. Murder as routine, death as background noise. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as efficient, like a man fixing a leak. If someone caused a problem, he removed it. Simple, clean. Over time, that simplicity began to warp into pride. He started to believe he was untouchable. Each successful hit reinforced the illusion that he could live without consequence. The police never connected the dots. Witnesses never talked. Fear protected him as much as skill. And in the criminal world, that made him invaluable. But inside that growing empire of silence, something else was taking shape, a dangerous overconfidence. He began to take jobs outside official channels, freelance work that crossed boundaries. Sometimes he killed for money, sometimes for insult, sometimes simply to prove he could. The line between contract and impulse blurred until it disappeared entirely. When people talk about serial killers, they often describe compulsion, a hunger they can't control. But Richard wasn't like that. He didn't kill because he had to. He killed because he could. The difference made him far more terrifying. There's a story that captures that shift. The night he was driving home, and a man in another car cut him off, shouting insults through the window. Most people would curse and move on. Richard followed him for 20 miles, calm and patient. When the man pulled into a rest stop, Richard got out, approached, and ended his life with a single shot. No words, no warning. Then he continued home, stopped for coffee, and went to bed. That's when the transformation was complete. Killing no longer required reason. It had become reflex. He wasn't reckless. He was meticulous. He made sure bodies disappeared or were found only when he wanted them to be. He dumped some in rivers, buried others deep in Jersey marshlands. Once, he even drove a body into Pennsylvania and left it for wildlife to handle. To him, disposal was as important as the act itself, part of the craft. At home, the mask never slipped. His wife knew he was dangerous, but she didn't know how much. His children adored him, and he made sure they saw only the father, the man who taught them to ride bikes, who showed up for school plays. But every lie, every smile, was part of the performance. And behind it all, the Iceman's legend was growing. The Mafia began trusting him with larger, more sensitive contracts. Men like Roy DeMeo from the Gambino family heard of him. DeMeo's crew, known for their own brutality, found in Richard someone who matched their ruthlessness but lacked their ego. He became a silent weapon for hire, a man who didn't belong to one family, who could cross territories without drawing attention. That neutrality made him rich and dangerous. In a world built on loyalty, he belonged to no one but himself. The Mafia valued that independence, but it also made them wary. Men who answered to no one couldn't be controlled. Still, as long as he delivered, no one questioned him. The irony was that the same traits that made him lethal, calmness, self-control, invisibility, also made him forgettable. He moved through mob history like a shadow, present at events no one could later prove. The names of his victims faded, but the fear remained. If he wanted you gone, one associate said, you'd never even see him coming. By the late 60s, he was balancing both worlds perfectly, the suburban father and the professional killer. The boy who once lived in terror had become the man everyone else feared. Yet beneath the control, a quiet madness was forming. Every kill made him feel more alive, but also more empty. He didn't realize it yet, but the silence he craved was slowly consuming him. Years later, sitting in prison, he described that time as the best years. He smiled when he said it. I had everything: family, money, respect. Then, after a pause, he added softly, and I never had to pretend to be afraid. That was his truth. Every act of violence, every body, was a rebellion against the fear that ruled his childhood. Each kill was a conversation with the past, a message to his father, to the world, to himself. You can't hurt me anymore. But the problem with power built on death is that it never stops demanding more. The satisfaction fades. The emptiness grows. And though Richard didn't know it yet, the cracks were already forming, tiny fractures in the ice that would one day shatter everything he'd built. The first kill gave him peace. The next 100 gave him purpose. But peace built on blood never lasts. And in the distance, as he climbed higher into the underworld, the law was beginning to whisper his name, softly at first, then louder, like footsteps in the snow drawing closer and closer to the Iceman's door. Chapter 4. From Street Thug to Enforcer. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, like frost creeping over glass, one layer at a time, until the world could no longer see the man behind it. By the late 1950s, Richard Kuklinski was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a man who had learned how to rule through silence. The Jersey City kid who used to flinch at every noise now moved through the streets with the calm of a predator who had nothing left to fear. He had discovered his place in the food chain, and it was at the top. In the back alleys of New Jersey, he became known as a man you didn't cross. Not because he was loud or brash. Quite the opposite. It was the quiet ones you had to fear, the men who didn't boast, didn't threaten, just acted. Richard was that man. When he walked into a room, people lowered their voices. When he stared, they looked away. It wasn't what he said that frightened them. It was the stillness, the complete absence of hesitation. He didn't posture like other tough guys. He didn't need to. His confidence came from experience, from knowing that if violence was required, he would not think, he would not hesitate, he would simply do. His work for the local crews had earned him a reputation as someone dependable, discreet, and utterly without conscience. And in the world of organized crime, those three things were gold. The DeCavalcante family, small but deeply rooted in New Jersey, began to notice him. They ran the usual rackets: gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and they needed enforcers who could collect debts and deliver messages that words alone couldn't send. Richard became their favorite kind of problem solver. If someone was late on payment, he handled it. If someone disrespected the family, he corrected it. At first, it was simple. Show up, rough a guy up, break a few ribs, collect what was owed. But it never stayed simple for long. Richard's size alone was intimidating. 6'5", broad-shouldered, with a cold stare that could make grown men stammer. Yet what made him truly dangerous was his patience. He'd wait hours in a car, without moving, studying a target's habits, learning when they were most vulnerable. It wasn't about rage. It was about precision. He treated every job like a hunt. One winter night, he was sent to collect from a nightclub owner who had been stalling the DeCavalcantes for weeks. The man laughed in Richard's face, told him to tell his bosses to come get it themselves. Richard didn't argue. He left, came back the next night, waited until closing, then followed the man into the parking lot. When the owner turned, Richard hit him once, a single blow that cracked his skull against the pavement. The sound echoed in the empty lot. He stood over him for a moment, then knelt and whispered, "You should have paid." The next morning, the man's business partner delivered the full amount, plus interest. No one asked questions. The lesson had been learned. From that point forward, Richard wasn't just muscle. He was fear incarnate. Word spread beyond Jersey. The Gambino family, one of the 5 families of New York, started to take notice. They had their own enforcers, their own hitmen, but men like Richard were rare, disciplined, efficient, invisible. Roy DeMeo, a rising soldier under Paul Castellano, was particularly intrigued. DeMeo ran a crew that specialized in violence, and when he heard about this Polish kid from Jersey who killed without hesitation, he wanted to see him for himself. Their meeting was simple, almost casual. DeMeo tested him, gave him a small job, collect from a debtor in Brooklyn who had been dodging payments. Richard took the job and completed it within 24 hours. The man was found dead in his car, his body dumped near an alley. DeMeo was impressed. There was no trace, no panic, no loose ends. He saw in Kuklinski what few others had, a killer's instinct wrapped in discipline. After that, he started feeding him more work. It was through DeMeo that Richard entered the true underworld of organized crime, the dark core of the Mafia where rules were law and silence was sacred. He learned the hierarchy, the unspoken codes. You never killed a made man without permission. You never spoke names out loud. You never let emotion guide your hand. It was business, nothing more. And business was booming. For Richard, these jobs weren't about loyalty. He never cared about the families or their politics. He cared about efficiency. If the price was right, he didn't need to know the reason. It didn't matter who the target was, a rival mobster, a loose-lipped associate, a gambler who couldn't pay. He treated them all the same. He'd walk up, look them in the eye, and end it cleanly. Sometimes he used a gun, sometimes a knife. Sometimes he preferred more creative methods, things that couldn't be traced, things that left no clues. Cyanide would later become his signature. A drop in a drink, a puff of powder in a face, quick, quiet, untraceable. But in these early years, it was all about precision. He learned from DeMeo's crew, who were infamous for their brutal efficiency. They dismembered bodies, stuffed them into garbage bags, dissolved them in acid. Richard didn't enjoy that part. He found it messy, undignified. He preferred methods that left no body to find. He'd dump them in rivers, bury them in remote woods, or sometimes just make them vanish completely. The fewer pieces there were, the cleaner the job. He once told an associate, "If you can't find the problem, you can't prove there was one." That became his philosophy. To him, murder wasn't about revenge or message. It was about resolution. He fixed problems permanently. But beneath that calm surface, the violence was beginning to shape him in ways he didn't fully understand. Every kill stripped away another layer of humanity. He stopped seeing faces, stopped remembering names. People became tasks, and tasks became routine. He didn't flinch at blood anymore. The first time he killed, he had felt something like electricity rush through him, the shock of doing the unthinkable. Now, it was as ordinary as changing a tire. At home, the contrast was surreal. His family life looked picture perfect. He bought a bigger house in Dumont, New Jersey, with a neat lawn and a quiet street. His wife, Barbara, decorated the place with warm colors, trying to make it feel like a home. To the neighbors, they were the ideal suburban family. He grilled on weekends, attended church on Sundays, even volunteered at his daughter's school events. People liked him. They called him a family man. They had no idea what kind of business trips took him away for days at a time. When he came home, he was affectionate, even playful. But every so often, something dark flickered through. A word, a gesture, something small could trigger him. Barbara learned to tread carefully. Once, during an argument, she called him a liar. He went still, then hit her so hard she couldn't speak for days. Hours later, he came back with ice, tears in his eyes, apologizing, begging forgiveness. The next morning, he bought her flowers. The same hands that caused pain could be tender, and that contradiction confused her more than the violence itself. The duality became his greatest disguise. By day, he was the loving father, the protective husband. By night, he was the Mafia's ghost. He learned how to compartmentalize so completely that the two worlds never seemed to touch. But inside, the walls between them were beginning to thin. His efficiency made him indispensable. By the early 1970s, he was doing work for multiple families, the Gambinos, the Genovese, even occasional jobs for the Lucchese's. He was a freelancer, a mercenary of death. He didn't pledge allegiance to any boss. That independence made him valuable, but it also made him unpredictable. The families respected him, but they never fully trusted him. He was too quiet, too controlled. A man without fear is a man without loyalty. When he worked with DeMeo, he saw up close how the mafia operated. The hierarchy, the greed, the paranoia. DeMeo trusted Richard because he was efficient, but even he was wary. The DeMeo crew killed hundreds of people, often their own associates, to keep secrets buried. And yet, through it all, Richard remained calm, untouched. He was the professional in a world of impulsive men. Once after a hit went wrong, DeMeo panicked. The victim had connections, and there were whispers of retaliation. Richard simply said, "Then we take care of the whispers." The simplicity of it silenced the room. He was always thinking 2 steps ahead, not out of fear, but out of habit. To him, foresight wasn't strategy, it was survival. But not everything went smoothly. Violence has a way of multiplying, of drawing its own kind. With each job, the stakes grew higher. The money was good, but the paranoia was better. Richard started carrying weapons everywhere. Guns, knives, even cyanide spray hidden in a flask. He didn't trust anyone, not even those who paid him. He understood that in this world, the line between employer and target could vanish in a single night. Despite his caution, he enjoyed the respect. Men who once mocked him now feared to speak his name. The same streets where he had been bullied as a boy now belonged to him. Power had finally replaced pain. But power is never quiet for long. He began to take pleasure not in killing itself, but in the control it gave him. The way people trembled when he entered a room, the way silence followed his footsteps, it fed something deep inside him. The child who once hid from violence was now its architect. Every act of dominance, every act of obedience he commanded, was revenge on the ghosts of his past. He started to collect trophies, not physical ones, but memories, faces, reactions, the final expressions of his victims. He'd replay them in his mind like scenes from a film. It wasn't pride exactly. It was study. Each death taught him something new. How people react when cornered. How long it takes for fear to turn into resignation. He was perfecting his craft, and that perfection became obsession. But even perfection has limits. In the mid-70s, the mafia world began to change. Law enforcement was getting smarter, wiretaps more common, informants more frequent. The golden age of organized crime was beginning to crack. Yet Richard remained untouched. He wasn't part of any official crew, so his name never appeared in investigations. He was the invisible man behind the chaos, the executioner no one could trace. He once said, "The best killer is the one you never know existed." And for nearly 3 decades, he proved it. His kills left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no pattern. Police departments across state lines had no idea their unsolved cases were all connected by one man driving home to suburban New Jersey to kiss his wife goodnight. In a strange way, he saw himself as a professional. Killing was his trade, and he took pride in doing it better than anyone else. But what he didn't realize was that professionalism in murder is still madness. It was eroding what little humanity he had left. Sometimes, after a job, he'd sit in his car, listening to the hum of the engine, and feel nothing. Just emptiness. The silence he had once craved now felt heavy. But he never allowed himself to linger on it. There was always another job, another problem to solve. The ice inside him was spreading, and he didn't even notice. He was no longer the frightened boy from Jersey City. He was the man everyone feared to cross, the enforcer, the ghost, the problem solver. But in building that reputation, he had traded something he could never get back. The part of him that could still feel warmth, love, or guilt had been buried under layers of blood and ice. And though he didn't know it yet, every job he took, every body he dropped, was bringing him closer to the one thing he could never escape, the moment when the silence he worshipped would finally turn against him. Chapter 5. The Mafia Connection. There's a moment in every outlaw's life when the shadows reach out and take him fully in, when the small-time hustler becomes part of something larger, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. For Richard Kuklinski, that moment came when the Mafia stopped treating him like a tool and started using him like a weapon. The street thug from Jersey had become a professional, but now he was about to step into the machine that perfected the art of killing. The mob didn't care about his past, his pain, or his reasons. They cared about results, and Richard Kuklinski delivered them without hesitation. Through the late 1960s and into the 70s, he had already earned a name in the underworld. Quiet, dependable, precise. A man who could be trusted with the dirtiest work. The Mafia valued three things: loyalty, silence, and skill. Richard had mastered all three, or at least appeared to. In truth, his loyalty wasn't to any family. It was to the silence itself. He didn't kill for honor or tradition. He killed because it made sense. The Mafia, with all its rules and rituals, gave him a system, a way to practice his dark trade with purpose. The connection deepened through Roy DeMeo, the ruthless Gambino enforcer whose crew was known for efficiency and terror. DeMeo liked men who could follow orders without emotion, and Richard fit the profile perfectly. He was older than most of DeMeo's crew, but that only made him more intimidating. DeMeo was loud, impulsive, often reckless. Kuklinski was the opposite: calm, methodical, emotionless. Together, they formed a strange balance: chaos and control. The DeMeo crew operated out of the Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn, a modest-looking bar that hid one of the most feared murder factories in New York. Victims were lured there, executed in the back room, dismembered, and packaged for disposal. DeMeo's men were efficient, but they were sloppy in spirit, drinking, bragging, sometimes careless. Richard didn't join their rituals. He did his jobs quietly, away from the noise, away from the bar. If DeMeo's crew were butchers, Kuklinski was a surgeon. When DeMeo handed him contracts, he didn't ask for details. He never wanted to know who the target was or why. It was cleaner that way. Sometimes he'd drive to a warehouse, sometimes to a diner, sometimes to a quiet road near the Hudson. He'd wait, patient as a cat, until the moment came. One shot, one strike, one breath, and the world went quiet again. The Mafia had 1,000 ways to make a man disappear, but Kuklinski introduced a new one: freezing. He realized that by keeping a body frozen before disposal, he could confuse coroners about the time of death. That gave him a cushion, a window of safety. He could kill someone today and dump them weeks later, and investigators would think the murder happened recently. It wasn't just clever, it was scientific. That's how the nickname the Iceman began to circulate in whispers among mobsters. Not because he froze bodies, that came later, but because of his demeanor. Cold, detached, efficient. He often worked freelance for different families: the Gambinos, the DeCavalcantes, the Genovese, even the Lucchese's. Each saw him as a useful outsider. He wasn't Italian, so he could never be made, but he could go where made men couldn't. He was neutral territory, a hired storm that left no fingerprints. The mob liked that. If the job was sensitive, if a name needed to vanish quietly, they called Kuklinski. He didn't drink, didn't gossip, didn't mingle. He'd take an assignment, disappear for a week, and come back with results. No questions, no drama. His methods evolved as his confidence grew. Guns were common, but he preferred creativity. Cyanide became his weapon of choice. He called it clean and reliable. He could slip it into food or spray it from a bottle disguised as a nasal spray. A single breath could kill a man within seconds, leaving no trace. He liked the control it gave him: invisible death, silent and efficient. He experimented constantly, testing poisons on stray dogs, timing their deaths like a scientist taking notes. It wasn't sadism, Not exactly. It was curiosity. He wanted perfection. He wanted to kill without mess, without sound, without emotion. The irony was that this obsession with control made him the Mafia's perfect asset, and also its most unpredictable liability. One story circulated quietly through the underworld. A man named George Maliband, a small-time con artist, had made the mistake of crossing Kuklinski in a gun deal. Richard invited him for a drive, promising business. Somewhere in the woods of North Jersey, he pulled the car over, shot him point blank, and left the body to rot. Days later, he returned to the site and found animals had gotten to it. He calmly buried what was left and drove away. No panic, no second thoughts, just another problem solved. Another case involved a man named Gary Smith, a small-time thief who bragged too much about knowing the Iceman. Richard decided the talk was dangerous. He and another associate lured Smith to a motel room, dosed him with cyanide, and watched as he convulsed silently. But death took longer than expected. Afraid of noise, Richard stuffed his body under the mattress, left, and returned the next day to finish the job. When police later found the decomposed corpse, they couldn't tell how he died. That was how precise he had become, death without evidence. Through these years, his connection with the Mafia grew stronger. They saw in him a rare kind of killer, disciplined, invisible, unshakable. He was the man who never flinched, who never asked for backup, who never bragged. To the mob, those qualities were sacred. But Richard's loyalty was always transactional. He wasn't a soldier bound by honor. He was a businessman bound by profit. The Mafia respected him, but they never embraced him fully. He wasn't one of them. He was useful, but disposable. That unspoken tension lingered in every handshake, every exchange of envelopes. The bosses admired his work, but they feared his independence. In the underworld, fear is a currency, and Richard had plenty of it. He knew men whispered behind his back, calling him the Iceman, the devil from Jersey, the Polish ghost. He didn't care. Fear kept him safe. It kept people from asking too many questions. Yet beneath that cold precision, cracks were forming. The Mafia world was changing. The old codes were breaking. The 70s were bleeding into the 80s, and the FBI was listening to every phone call, bugging every club. The streets were filled with paranoia. Informants were everywhere. And in that atmosphere, even the most careful men began to slip. Richard noticed it first in DeMeo. The man who once commanded fear had started to unravel, growing paranoid, violent, unpredictable. The bodies were piling up too fast, the Gemini lounge reeking of blood and gasoline. Richard kept his distance. He didn't like chaos. He preferred solitude, control, predictability. DeMeo's madness was a liability, and Richard had no use for liabilities. When DeMeo eventually vanished, killed, most believed, by his own crew on orders from Castellano, Richard didn't mourn him. He simply moved on to new clients. Death, after all, was business. The Mafia had hundreds of DeMeos. There would never be another Kuklinski. His relationship with the Genovese family deepened next. They were quieter than the Gambinos, more disciplined, more strategic. Men like Vincent Chin Gigani ran their operations like chess matches, slow, deliberate, precise. They valued discretion, and Richard offered exactly that. He became a ghostly extension of their power, a man they could use when something needed to vanish without a trace. He carried out hits across state lines: New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, even Florida. Some were revenge killings. Others were cleanups, removing potential informants before they could talk. Every job reinforced his legend. To the outside world, he was a mystery. To the underworld, he was an institution. Still, not everyone trusted him. Some saw him as too cold, too independent. He didn't socialize, didn't laugh, didn't drink with the crew. When they toasted victories, he sat in silence. When they bragged about numbers, he listened quietly, his face unreadable. That silence unsettled them. You can predict a loud man. You can never predict the quiet one. There were moments, though rare, when the old rage flickered through. Once, a low-level mobster mocked him during a job, called him a dumb Polak, and laughed. Richard didn't say a word. He waited until the next night, invited him for a drive, and shot him mid-sentence. When another associate asked why, Richard simply said, "He disrespected me." That was all the explanation he needed. Violence became his language. Respect was his grammar. In the Mafia, that combination earned admiration and fear. Men who met him once never forgot the encounter. He radiated something beyond menace. It was presence, the weight of a man who'd seen and done everything and come out untouched. By the late 70s, Kuklinski was earning thousands per job. He lived comfortably, driving nice cars, wearing good suits, taking his family on vacations. His wife believed he worked in film distribution, dealing in foreign rights. He didn't lie exactly. He just left out the parts that involved cyanide and corpses. To his children, he was a gentle giant who protected them fiercely. To his wife, he was both savior and tormentor. But to the Mafia, he was a necessary evil. He became part of an era when the mob still ruled New York, when the commission decided who lived and who died, and the city's skyline glittered under a web of power and blood. Richard was the invisible thread in that web, tying it all together through fear. In interviews years later, he recalled those days with chilling calm. "They trusted me," he said. "I got the job done. That's all that mattered." When asked how many he killed, he smirked. "Hundreds, maybe more. I lost count after a while." The interviewer pressed him. How did he sleep at night? Richard smiled faintly. "Like a baby. Why wouldn't I? They were all bad people anyway." That rationalization, that he only killed those who deserved it, became the story he told himself to make sense of the blood. In truth, he didn't care who they were. He cared only that they were targets. And in that moral vacuum, the Mafia found its perfect hitman. The connection between Kuklinski and the mob was built on mutual convenience. They gave him money and purpose. He gave them silence and death. It wasn't friendship. It was mathematics. But in the end, even mathematics fails when greed and paranoia enter the equation. By the dawn of the 80s, the Mafia was rotting from the inside. Informants were trading loyalty for immunity. FBI operations like the famous Pizza Connection were dismantling empires. The commission trials were on the horizon. The old rules were dying. And in that chaos, men like Richard, freelance killers, outsiders, became both useful and dangerous. The families needed him, but they also feared what he knew. He could sense the shift. Jobs became riskier, conversations shorter, eyes darted more. Even the envelopes of cash came with hesitation. He began to wonder when the day would come that the mob, the very machine he had served so faithfully, would decide that their silent weapon had become too loud to exist. And when that day came, when the underworld turned inward and the hunters became the hunted, the Iceman's frozen calm would be tested for the first time. Because in the Mafia, loyalty was an illusion, and silence was never enough to keep the wolves away forever. Chapter 6: Methods of Death. To understand Richard Kuklinski, you have to understand how he thought about killing. Not as cruelty, not as chaos, but as craft. He wasn't a man who stumbled into violence. He studied it, perfected it, turned it into a system so calculated that death became predictable. While most killers relied on impulse or rage, Richard operated like an engineer. Every murder was a process, every method tested, refined, and improved. He wasn't looking for blood or screams. He was looking for silence, the perfect silence that followed when life stopped moving. He killed for the Mafia, for money, and sometimes for personal reasons. But the motive never mattered. The act was always the same: planned, detached, and efficient. He could look into a man's eyes, end him, and then go home to eat dinner with his family without missing a beat. That's what separated him from the rest. Not the number of victims, but the precision of his methods. He once said, "I didn't like to do the same thing twice. It's sloppy. You learn by doing it different." That mindset turned him from an enforcer into an artist of death. He used everything: guns, knives, chains, cyanide, even bare hands. He tested poisons the way a chemist tests formulas. He experimented with ways to make death cleaner, quieter, less noticeable. It wasn't about sadism. It was about control. Control was the only feeling that ever made sense to him. Guns were his starting point, the simplest, most direct tool. But he didn't use them the way others did. He practiced for hours at a time, shooting bottles in the woods, learning to silence his breathing, to steady his pulse. He could hit a moving target from 50 feet away without flinching. For close-range hits, he favored a small-caliber pistol. It made less noise, left a smaller wound, and gave him more time to disappear before anyone noticed. If he wanted to send a message, he'd use a shotgun. But mostly, he preferred quiet. He believed sound was evidence. The less the world heard, the longer he survived. Then came blades. He wasn't sentimental about them. They were tools like any other. But knives gave him control that bullets couldn't. He could see the life leave a man's eyes, measure the fear, feel the heartbeat slow beneath his grip. He used that closeness to read people, to understand what panic looked like when there was no escape. You learn who someone really is when they know they're going to die, he once said. That's when all the lies fall off. He didn't enjoy the suffering. He wasn't like the men who laughed while they killed. To him, pain was just a side effect of efficiency. He didn't want to prolong it, but he didn't avoid it either. If a man begged, he ignored him. If he cried, he waited. There was no empathy, but there also wasn't cruelty. Just detachment, the coldest form of indifference. But the method that defined him, the one that made him legendary in the underworld, was poison. Specifically, cyanide. He discovered it by accident. One of his Mafia contacts mentioned a hitman who used it years earlier, and Richard was intrigued. He began studying it quietly, buying small doses from chemical suppliers under fake names, experimenting with it on stray animals, and, according to him, even homeless men who wouldn't be missed. He needed to understand how it worked, how fast it killed, how to deliver it unnoticed, how to mask the smell of almonds it left behind. Soon he was carrying small vials of cyanide everywhere. He mixed it with liquids, soaked tissues in it, or loaded it into spray bottles disguised as asthma inhalers. A quick puff to the face, a drink laced with a few drops, that was all it took. Within seconds, the victim's body would seize, then fall still. No noise, no mess. He'd wait until the convulsions stopped, then drag the body to the car, drive off, and dispose of it like garbage. It was almost clinical. Cyanide was perfect, he said in an interview years later. You didn't have to make noise. You didn't have to make a mess. It was quiet, like they just went to sleep. He experimented constantly, refining his technique. Sometimes he used powder, sometimes liquid. He once slipped it into a hamburger and handed it to a man he was hired to kill. The victim took a bite, joked about the taste, and dropped dead before he could finish the sentence. Richard laughed when he told the story later, not out of joy, but at the absurd simplicity of it. He died with a mouthful of burger, he said. That's how easy it can be. That ease made him dangerous. The Mafia could trust him to do any job, anywhere, without trace. No noise, no witnesses, no cleanup. He made murder look effortless, and that reputation became its own kind of power. People feared him not because they saw what he did, but because they didn't. His victims disappeared, and their bodies, when found, told no stories. His fascination with freezing bodies came later, a trick to buy time. He realized that if he froze a corpse before dumping it, coroners would misjudge the time of death, sometimes by weeks. That gave him alibis he didn't even need. He kept old freezers in warehouses, using them to store bodies before disposal. When he released them, he let them thaw partially, then dumped them somewhere isolated. By the time they were found, decomposition confused everything. The police couldn't connect the deaths. To them, it looked like random crime. To him, it was genius. One of his victims, a man named Percy House, became infamous for that reason. The body had been frozen solid for months before being discovered. The press called it the work of a professional, but no one knew how professional until years later, when Richard explained it in that chilling monotone of his. You put them in the freezer for a while, he said, and the cops can't tell when they died. It's like giving yourself an extra life. The idea of death as craft fascinated him. He didn't see it as horror. He saw it as evolution. If you do something enough, he once said, you get good at it. Doesn't matter what it is. He wasn't boasting. He was simply stating fact. The repetition had stripped the meaning away. Killing had become muscle memory. He worked for the Mafia, but he wasn't bound by their traditions. The old Italian killers followed codes, rules about targets, family, and respect. Richard ignored all of that. If you paid him, he killed. It didn't matter if the target was a rival gangster, a debtor, or a bystander who saw too much. The act itself didn't change. He once said, I didn't see people. I saw situations. If a situation needed fixing, I fixed it. That philosophy turned him into something beyond human, an efficient, emotionless machine. And yet, the very precision that made him so feared also made him fascinating. He could recall details of every method, every job, every sound, the click of a gun's safety, the hiss of cyanide, the dull thud of a body hitting pavement. Those sounds became his symphony. He treated murder like carpentry. The tools changed depending on the job. A hammer if it was close. A rope if he needed silence. A car if he wanted it to look like an accident. He once used a crossbow to kill a man, simply because he wanted to test its accuracy. The bolt pierced the man's skull instantly. Later, he described it with clinical precision. It worked fine, he said. Clean, quiet, no mess. That was how he spoke, as if discussing maintenance, not murder. What made him even more terrifying was his adaptability. He learned to use whatever the environment offered. If the job was in a bar, he'd use a drink. If it was in a car, he'd stage a crash. If it was outdoors, he'd dig a hole before the meeting. He thought 3 steps ahead, always planning the disposal before the kill. If you can't hide it, he said, you don't do it. He buried bodies in woods, dumped them in rivers, left them in alleys. He once threw a man off a bridge in broad daylight, blending into traffic as if nothing had happened. No one noticed. The secret, he said, was timing. People only see what they expect to see. You move like you belong there. Nobody looks twice. That was his superpower. Invisibility through confidence. He even used animals for disposal. Pigs, stray dogs, rats, whatever worked. He'd feed remains to wildlife or scatter them across remote woods. Once, he dumped a body in a cave known to be filled with rats. When he returned days later, there was nothing left but bones. Nature does the cleanup for you, he said with a faint grin. Despite his efficiency, Richard wasn't invincible. Mistakes happened, but they never rattled him. Once a gun jammed mid-hit. He didn't panic. He used his hands instead. The calmness under pressure was what terrified even his associates. They said he could kill a man, light a cigarette, and talk about sports in the same breath. To outsiders, he seemed superhuman. But the truth was simpler. Killing was the only thing that made sense to him. Everything else in life was noise. The world of bills, neighbors, traffic, emotions, all of it bored him. But in the moment of a kill, the world narrowed to a single, perfect point. No confusion, no fear, just control. His methods didn't evolve for glory. They evolved for survival. He knew the Mafia could turn on him at any time. He also knew the cops were getting smarter. So he adapted. He learned to kill without leaving clues, without DNA, without witnesses. He burned clothes, wiped guns, wore gloves, used fake plates. His mind was a checklist. Every move rehearsed, every detail covered. That's why, for decades, no one caught him. Even his family never suspected the scale of it. His wife thought he worked in the trucking business. His children believed he was an ordinary provider. They saw the cars, the toys, the vacations. They never saw the weapons, the cyanide, the freezers. And Richard made sure of it. He compartmentalized everything. When he crossed the threshold of his home, the killer shut down, and the father switched on. It was seamless, terrifyingly so. But the mind can only hold so many secrets before they begin to leak. As he aged, he started to talk, not to confess, but to impress. He began bragging to lower-level associates about his efficiency, about the way the mob relied on him. In the Mafia, loose talk was death. He didn't realize that yet. To him, silence was still a choice. He hadn't learned that eventually, it becomes a sentence. The methods that had protected him, the poisons, the freezers, the precision, were beginning to attract attention. Rumors spread. Detectives from multiple states began connecting cases that shared the same strange patterns. No witnesses, no struggle, impossible to time. They didn't have a name yet, but they had a ghost. A phantom who killed like a scientist and vanished like smoke. In one interview, when asked how he decided which method to use, Richard leaned back, smiled faintly, and said, "Depends on my mood." It was the kind of answer that sent chills down the spine of anyone listening. Because for him, mood determined method, and method determined whether someone lived or died. He wasn't driven by hatred or revenge. He was driven by the satisfaction of perfection, the knowledge that when he acted, nothing could go wrong. And that perfection became his addiction. Killing wasn't about money anymore. It was about mastery. Each new method was a challenge. Each death, a proof of his control. But control, like ice, always cracks. He couldn't see it yet, but the world around him was changing. The Mafia's power was slipping. Law enforcement was learning his patterns. And the silence he loved so much was starting to hum with suspicion. For now, though, he was still untouchable. The man who killed without conscience, who turned murder into mathematics. His methods were his shield, his legacy, his curse. He didn't know it yet, but the same precision that made him unstoppable would one day make him predictable. And in that predictability, the ice he built around his life would finally begin to melt. Chapter 7: The Double Life. Every killer believes they can keep the two halves of their world apart, the one soaked in blood and the one draped in normality. For years, Richard Kuklinski managed to do what few men in his position ever could. He lived two lives perfectly balanced, as if God himself had drawn a line between them. On one side stood the devoted husband, the father who attended school recitals and family barbecues. On the other stood the Iceman, the silent professional who killed without hesitation and disappeared into the fog of the Mafia's underworld. What made him terrifying wasn't just how he killed. It was how easily he could switch between the two worlds, as though changing stations on a radio. One moment, a smile at the dinner table. The next, a man suffocating in the back of his car. To his family, he was Richard, steady, hard-working, protective. To the world beneath the surface, he was something else entirely. His wife, Barbara, met him when she was still young and impressionable, working as a secretary at a trucking company. Richard was quiet, polite, with a kind of magnetic calm that drew her in. He wasn't handsome in the usual sense, but there was something about him, a steadiness, a quiet authority that made her feel safe. He opened doors, sent flowers, called her every day. When he looked at her, it was with complete attention, like nothing else in the world mattered. She didn't know it then, but that same intensity was the mask of a predator who had spent his life studying fear. For him, love and control were inseparable. In the beginning, he was charming. He talked about wanting a family, about leaving behind the rough edges of his youth. He told her he worked in film distribution, importing and exporting foreign movies. It sounded exotic, believable. When they married, she thought she'd found her stability, a man who would protect her from the chaos of the world. And in a twisted way, he did. No one dared touch her. No one dared disrespect her. But protection in Richard's world always came with a price. He saw his family as extensions of himself, reflections of the control he demanded from life. And when control slipped, when the smallest thing didn't go his way, the calm vanished like smoke. The first time he hit her, it wasn't with anger, but with certainty, like someone swatting a fly. She had said something about money, questioned one of his late nights. His hand moved before his mind even registered it. The crack echoed through the kitchen, and for a moment, both of them froze. Then, without apology, he told her she should never question him again. Afterward, he brought flowers. She tried to believe it was an accident, a moment of stress. But deep down, she felt the truth. She had married a man with storms hidden behind his still eyes. To the outside world, though, they looked perfect. The Kuklinskis lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Dumont, New Jersey, with neatly trimmed hedges and a white picket fence. Their children played in the yard, their dog barked at passing cars, and Richard waved at neighbors like any other father coming home from work. He attended church on Sundays, helped carry groceries for older women, and smiled for family photos. In every picture, he looked calm, almost too calm, a man who had built a life so ordinary that no one would ever question what he did when the sun went down. Behind closed doors, life was different. The house was filled with tension that could shift without warning. Some days he was gentle, laughing with his daughters, watching TV, telling stories about his business trips. Other days, he was ice, silent, brooding, unpredictable. His children learned early to watch his face, to read the smallest movements, to know when to stay quiet. They didn't know why their father's moods changed so fast, only that when his eyes went dark, the house held its breath. Barbara lived in that cycle of fear and illusion for years. She loved him, or at least the version of him she believed still existed somewhere beneath the violence. She told herself he was just under pressure, that the world was unfair to him, that every man had demons. But no explanation could make sense of the nights he disappeared without warning, returning days later with a calm that felt unnatural. She noticed the blood once, a dark stain on his sleeve that he brushed off as an accident at work. She didn't press. Somewhere inside, she knew that whatever he was involved in, it was better not to ask. Curiosity was dangerous in a world built on silence. Richard's double life thrived because of his discipline. He kept his routine sharp, his stories consistent. If he left for a job, he'd call home to say he was working late. If he needed to dispose of a body, he'd plan it around family events. Birthdays, school plays, church gatherings, all scheduled around murder. He built an invisible wall between his two identities, and for years, no one saw through it. Even his closest mafia associates never met his family, and his family never met anyone from that world. The two universes coexisted without touching. He could shift from one to the other with terrifying ease. One moment, he was in a warehouse, dumping acid over a corpse. Hours later, he was sitting in a diner with Barbara, sipping coffee, listening to her talk about the kids. The same hands that held a gun in the morning held his daughter's hand in the afternoon. He believed that separation was his gift, that he could keep darkness and light in perfect balance. But what he didn't see was that both halves were slowly consuming each other. At home, his need for control grew worse. He didn't tolerate mistakes. Not in his family, not in his image. If Barbara bought the wrong groceries, if the children were too loud, his temper erupted. He'd shout, slam doors, sometimes lash out violently, then retreat into silence for days. Afterward, he always apologized, his voice breaking with guilt. He'd swear it would never happen again, but it always did. Each apology was another layer of denial, another bandage over a wound that would never heal. The children learned to live between fear and love. They adored him because he was their father, the man who provided everything, who made them feel safe from the world. But they also feared him, not just his anger, but his unpredictability. He was never cruel to them directly, but the air changed when he walked in the room. They could feel the weight of something unspoken, something dangerous that followed him like a shadow. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Richard would stare into space, lost in thought. His daughters remembered those moments. The way his expression would harden, his jaw tighten, his eyes grow distant. He looked like he was somewhere else, a place only he could see. They didn't know that in those moments, he was replaying memories of the men he'd killed, the deals he'd made, the secrets he had to keep. The strangest part was how ordinary he seemed to everyone else. He wasn't the stereotypical mobster with flashy suits and gold chains. He dressed simply, spoke softly, kept to himself. Neighbors said he was polite, quiet, a good family man. Even the local priest thought he was a decent parishioner. No one ever suspected that the man who held hands with his wife in the pews had left bodies in freezers. His camouflage was his calmness. He blended in so perfectly that he became invisible. Money wasn't a problem. His work with the Mafia brought him more than enough cash. He bought his wife jewelry, took the family on vacations, paid for private school. But Barbara always wondered how he afforded it. He claimed he had investments, that he was lucky with business. The truth was simpler and darker. Every dollar came from death. He used blood money to build his version of the American dream. And for years, it worked. He believed he'd beaten the system, that he could be both a killer and a husband, both feared and loved. But the cracks were starting to show. The Mafia was beginning to lose control. Wiretaps, arrests, and paranoia were spreading through New York like disease. The old bosses were going down, and with them, the illusion of invincibility. Richard started noticing tails, cars that followed him, faces he didn't recognize. He grew suspicious of everyone, even his associates. He began carrying more weapons, more poison, sleeping with a gun by his bed. The paranoia that had once made him cautious was turning into obsession. At home, Barbara saw the change, but didn't understand it. He became quieter, more withdrawn. Some nights he'd sit in the dark, smoking, saying nothing for hours. She'd ask what was wrong, and he'd smile faintly and tell her to go to bed. But she could feel it, the tension growing, the sense that something was closing in. Their marriage, once built on illusion, was cracking under the pressure of secrets. One night, during a rare moment of vulnerability, he told her that he worried someone might come for him. She asked, "Why would anyone want to hurt you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "If anything ever happens to me, take the kids and run." It was the closest he ever came to admitting what he really was. She didn't ask again. Some truths were too dangerous to know. By the early 80s, his two lives were colliding in ways he couldn't control. The money was harder to hide. The stress was harder to mask. He was drinking more, though never enough to lose control, just enough to quiet the noise in his head. His wife noticed the smell, the tremor in his hands, the long silences that followed. She began to suspect the truth, not the details, but the essence. She knew he was capable of terrible things. She just didn't know how terrible. Once, she confronted him after hearing rumors from a neighbor, whispers about connections to the Mafia. His face went cold, and he told her never to repeat that word again. When she pushed, he pinned her against the wall, his voice low and steady. "You don't know what you're talking about. And if you keep talking, you'll regret it." Then he let go, kissed her forehead, and walked away. It was the moment she realized she was living with two men, one she loved, and one she feared more than death. Despite the tension, Richard remained fiercely protective of his family. He once beat a man nearly to death for yelling at Barbara in a parking lot. When his daughters were bullied, he found the kids' parents and made sure it never happened again. Violence was his way of showing love. He believed that as long as his family was safe, nothing else mattered. But safety in his world came from fear, not peace. And fear, like everything else in his life, was temporary. He often spoke of wanting to retire, to leave the business behind. He imagined moving somewhere quiet, maybe Florida, living off savings, fishing, watching his grandchildren grow. But he knew he could never escape it. The Mafia didn't let men like him walk away. And even if they did, he wasn't sure he could live without the thrill, without the control. The silence he loved came from death. Without it, he'd have to face the noise of ordinary life. And that scared him more than anything. The balance between his two worlds began to unravel faster than he realized. The law was closing in, the Mafia was turning inward, and his family was breaking under the weight of fear. Every lie he'd told, every murder he'd buried, was coming back like cracks in the ice, spreading silently beneath the surface. He could feel it, the shift, the inevitability. And in those final years before everything fell apart, Richard still tried to maintain the illusion. He still kissed his children goodnight, still mowed the lawn, still went to church. But behind the calm exterior, he knew the truth. The line between his two lives had finally vanished. The man who could once kill by night and love by day was gone. There was only one version left now, the cold, hollow one that had always been waiting underneath. It was only a matter of time before both worlds collapsed together, and when they did, the Iceman's perfect silence would finally shatter. Chapter 8: Business of Murder. By the early 1980s, murder had become a profession for Richard Kuklinski. Not a crime, not a sin, but a business transaction. He treated it like other men treated accounting or construction. You called him, gave him a name, and paid a fee. There was no small talk, no emotional exchange. You got what you paid for, and Richard delivered, every time. It was this sense of order that made him invaluable to the Mafia and terrifying to everyone else. He had taken something primal, the act of killing, and turned it into a routine, almost bureaucratic process. Death had become an industry, and he was its most reliable contractor. He kept records in his head. No notebooks, no written lists, just mental ledgers of who owed what, who had paid, and who had to go. When he looked at a man, he saw categories, not people. Some were clients, some were targets, some were liabilities. Everything had a price. There were no friends, only transactions. To him, the world was simple. Either you paid him to solve your problems, or you became one. His clients came from everywhere: mob bosses, loan sharks, drug dealers, even corrupt cops. They all wanted the same thing: someone gone, cleanly and quietly. Richard gave them options, like a menu: fast or slow, discreet or loud. He'd quote prices depending on difficulty. A quick shot might cost $5,000. A complicated job involving travel, disposal, or multiple victims could be $20,000 or $30,000. It was never about greed. It was about precision. He believed professionalism deserved compensation. He developed a rhythm to his business. Mornings were for planning, scouting locations, memorizing faces, studying patterns. Afternoons were for the work itself. Nights were for blending back into his suburban disguise. He'd take his wife out to dinner, watch television with his kids, or sit quietly in the yard smoking a cigarette while the world around him stayed blissfully ignorant. The compartmentalization was absolute. He never brought work home, never mixed one world with the other. That discipline kept him alive. His reputation spread through the underworld like smoke. The man who never missed, never spoke, never failed. The Iceman. If you owed money to the Gambinos or the Genovese, if you betrayed a crew, if you disrespected a boss, there was a chance Richard would be the last face you saw. He never carried the Mafia's titles, never swore oaths or kissed rings, but everyone knew who he was. He had become a freelance executioner, loyal to no one but his own rules. His preferred method remained cyanide: clean, fast, and nearly undetectable. He carried small vials in his pocket or hidden in breath spray bottles. Sometimes he used it in food, sometimes on the edge of a cigarette, sometimes as a mist. He claimed to have killed entire rooms of men by spraying it through air vents. No one could verify it, but the way he spoke about it, calm, detailed, matter of fact, made people believe him. "You do it right," he once said, "and they don't even have time to ask what happened." But cyanide wasn't his only tool. He adapted to whatever the job required. If he needed to make it look like an accident, he could. He'd tamper with cars, arrange overdoses, stage suicides. If he wanted to make a statement, he used a gun or a knife. Once, he reportedly beat a man to death with a tire iron just to test how long it would take. It wasn't rage. It was curiosity. He wanted to understand the mechanics, the biology of death. He wasn't emotional. He was empirical. Every kill was an experiment. He worked closely with Mafia figures like Sammy, the Bull Gravano, and others who respected his efficiency. Gravano later claimed that Kuklinski was used for certain sensitive jobs, though he kept his distance. Richard wasn't the kind of man anyone wanted to know too well. He didn't socialize, didn't drink, didn't brag. He arrived, did his work, got paid, and vanished. That reliability made him indispensable. But in a world fueled by paranoia, even reliability breeds suspicion. The Mafia began to wonder if he knew too much. A man who kills hundreds of people knows everyone's secrets. Richard understood this. That's why he kept himself detached. No loyalty, no gossip, no unnecessary words. The less you say, he liked to remind himself, the less they can use against you. He was fluent in silence. Still, the money gave him comfort. He had grown up poor, humiliated by hunger and violence. Now he could buy whatever he wanted. He drove luxury cars, wore expensive watches, and kept stacks of cash hidden in the walls of his home. Yet, despite his wealth, he never seemed to enjoy it. He didn't celebrate or indulge. He simply accumulated. The money was proof of his efficiency, a scorecard of how much control he had gained over a world that once beat him down. Barbara, his wife, saw only fragments of the truth. She noticed the cash, the gifts, the late nights. But whenever she asked, he'd tell her it was from business deals. Sometimes she suspected more, but fear kept her quiet. She'd learned over the years that questioning him led nowhere good. He provided, and in his mind, that was enough. "Everything I do," he once told her, "I do for this family." She didn't dare ask what everything meant. There was a twisted logic in that claim. He genuinely believed his murders were a form of provision. Each hit funded their life, the house, the cars, the vacations. He convinced himself he wasn't evil, just practical. "Somebody's got to do it," he'd say. "Might as well be me." That justification was how he slept at night. He wasn't killing people. He was completing transactions. The emotion was gone. Only math remained. His efficiency reached a point where he no longer needed orders. Sometimes, he killed preemptively. If he thought someone might betray him, he eliminated them before they had the chance. He believed in the power of anticipation. "The way I saw it," he explained years later, "if you wait until they make a move, you're already too late." He struck first, always. Fear had turned him into a prophet of violence. That mindset isolated him even further. The Mafia trusted him, but kept him at arm's length. He was too cold, too independent. They preferred killers who were loyal to their bosses, bound by code and family. Richard followed no one. He was a businessman, and in the Mafia, businessmen without loyalty were dangerous. They began to test him, feeding him small jobs, watching how he responded. He never flinched. His calmness only deepened the fear. He wasn't the type to intimidate through words. He used silence as his weapon. When someone owed him money or delayed payment, he didn't threaten. He simply stared. People talked themselves into fear. That was his gift. He let silence do the killing before the bullet ever came. He built a network of associates, drivers, suppliers, middlemen, but none of them knew much about him. He used them like disposable tools. If one of them talked too much, he replaced them. If one stole from him, he erased them. The turnover was constant, but his efficiency never faltered. To the underworld, he was more myth than man. The faceless killer who appeared, acted, and disappeared. At home, the pressure of his secret life began to show. The weight of lies, paranoia, and exhaustion made him more volatile. Barbara could feel the shift. His temper came faster, his silences grew longer. Some nights, he'd wake up sweating, pacing the floor, muttering under his breath. She'd ask what was wrong, and he'd say, "Just business." But his eyes told a different story, the look of a man haunted by ghosts he refused to name. The truth was that even he was starting to feel cracks in the ice. The killings no longer brought satisfaction. They brought noise, flashes of memory, faces that appeared uninvited in his mind. He told himself they didn't matter, but deep down, he knew the weight was building. Still, he pushed it down. There was always another job, another envelope of cash, another problem to fix. His business model was simple: speed, precision, silence. But the world around him was changing. The Mafia was losing its grip, the FBI was tightening surveillance, and old loyalties were crumbling. Technology was advancing: wiretaps, hidden cameras, informants wearing wires. Richard didn't trust anyone. He began refusing jobs that required meetings, insisting on intermediaries. He avoided phones, avoided names. "If I don't know who you are," he said. "You can't hurt me. But secrecy can't protect you forever." The more careful he became, the more paranoid he grew. Every sound felt like a tale, every stranger a cop. He started checking his mirrors, circling blocks before going home. He was too smart to believe he could go untouched forever, yet too proud to stop. Murder was his business, and business was the only thing that gave him identity. Without it, he was nothing, just another aging man from Jersey with a bad temper and an empty soul. By the mid-'80s, he had reached the peak of his career and the beginning of his fall. Law enforcement was starting to connect dots. Too many bodies with no explanation, too many disappearances linked to the same shadowy figure. But the underworld still relied on him, still paid him, still feared him. For a while longer, he could pretend everything was under control. He continued to tell himself he wasn't a bad man. He provided for his family. He punished the guilty. He didn't kill for fun, only for necessity. It was a lie he repeated so often that it began to sound true. In the quiet of his home, watching his children laugh, he could almost believe he was just another hard-working father. But deep inside, he knew better. The business he built was built on corpses, and every dollar in his pocket was soaked in blood. He once said, "Everybody kills somebody, one way or another. I just did it better." It wasn't arrogance. It was confession disguised as logic. That line defined him, a man who turned murder into commerce and called it professionalism. But in business, every empire eventually collapses. His clients were vanishing, either arrested or dead. His allies were turning on each other. The same mafia that once protected him was now hunting its own. The walls were closing in, slowly, invisibly. And somewhere out there, law enforcement was already watching, waiting for the moment when the Iceman would slip, when the perfect businessman of death would make one small mistake. For Richard, that mistake was coming. He just couldn't see it yet. For now, the Iceman remained at the top of his trade, unaware that the business he had built so carefully was already beginning to melt beneath his feet. Chapter 9. The Iceman's Code. For most men, morality is a compass. For Richard Kuklinski, it was a trick mirror, something that showed whatever reflection he needed to see. He had no commandments, no rules carved in stone. But he did have a code, one of his own making. It wasn't built on religion or ethics. It was built on control. It was the law of a man who believed he had transcended fear and consequence. To him, the world was divided between the strong and the weak, and he had made his choice long ago. The weak suffered, the strong survived, and survival excused everything. That was the essence of the Iceman's Code. He often told interviewers that he never killed innocent people. He said it like a confession, and a defense rolled into one. "I only killed people who deserved it," he'd say, eyes calm, voice level. To anyone listening, it sounded absurd. How could a man who claimed over 200 murders talk about justice? But in his mind, it was perfectly logical. If someone had wronged him, lied, cheated, or crossed the mafia, they weren't innocent. They were part of the game, and in the game, you played or you died. He saw himself as an enforcer of balance. When the world stepped out of line, he corrected it. He didn't think of himself as evil. Evil, to him, was personal, messy, emotional. He was just doing what needed to be done. Killing wasn't punishment. It was maintenance. The world, he believed, worked better when people like him existed. Men who did what others couldn't stomach. "If there weren't people like me," he once said, "there'd be chaos." It was a statement of ego disguised as justification. He didn't realize the chaos was already inside him. His code was a paradox. He believed in loyalty, but trusted no one. He valued honesty, but lied to everyone. He claimed to love his family, but terrified them. The contradictions didn't bother him. In his mind, logic and truth were flexible, tools to bend the world into something that made sense to him. He told himself that the people he killed were scum, liars, thieves, traitors. That belief made the murders cleaner. But when asked if he ever checked if that was true, he smiled faintly and said, "Didn't matter. They were a problem, and I fixed it." The Iceman's Code wasn't about morality. It was about order. He despised unpredictability, in people in emotions, in life. He believed that control was the only real virtue. Every time he killed, it was an assertion of that control. He chose the time, the place, the method. He decided how long they lived and how quickly they died. In a life that had started with helplessness, killing gave him the illusion of godhood. He despised weakness because it reminded him of himself as a boy, the terrified child hiding from his father's fists. That boy was the only version of himself he truly hated. Every act of dominance, every display of strength, was his way of burying that memory. To feel pity, to show emotion, would have been to acknowledge that weakness still existed somewhere inside him. So he froze it. He built walls of silence and ice around it until nothing could reach it. His calmness wasn't natural. It was armor. He had rules about killing, strange as they were. He never killed women or children. Not because he thought it was wrong, but because he saw no need. Women and kids don't play the game, he said. You don't waste time on them. He killed men who lied, cheated, or threatened his control. In his own distorted sense of justice, it was fair. He also refused to kill anyone he didn't have to. I wasn't a serial killer, he insisted. I was a businessman. Yet the difference was only in language. He killed for profit, for pride, for peace of mind. All the same things serial killers claim in different words. He also believed in efficiency. No torture, no spectacle. He looked down on men who enjoyed pain, calling them sloppy, emotional, weak. If you enjoy it, he said, you're losing control. For him, killing was a performance of precision. No wasted motion, no unnecessary cruelty. That detachment was what made him so dangerous. The absence of emotion wasn't humanity lost. It was humanity erased. His family lived under the same code without knowing it. His house ran on silence and obedience. He demanded order. No loud voices, no disobedience, no questioning. Barbara followed that rhythm, terrified but compliant. The children learned it too. The rules were unspoken, but absolute. When he said something, it happened. When he gave a look, they understood. Love and fear lived side by side, indistinguishable. He justified it as protection. I didn't want my kids growing up like I did, he said. I wanted them to be strong. But strength, in his world, meant silence. Despite his ruthlessness, there were cracks, moments when the mask slipped, if only slightly. Sometimes, while talking about his past, he would pause, and something would flicker in his eyes. Not remorse, not guilt, but recognition. I guess I wasn't meant to be anything else, he once muttered, almost to himself. It was the closest he ever came to admitting that maybe, deep down, he knew he was broken. But he'd always recover quickly, shake off the thought, and return his calm. Introspection was weakness. Reflection was dangerous. He was proud of his control. He called it his greatest strength. He could kill without blinking, lie without hesitation, and charm his way through any conversation. That control was his identity. But it was also his curse. When control is the only thing you worship, losing even a fraction of it feels like death. And as the years passed, that fear began to eat at him. The Mafia's world was unraveling. The FBI's investigations were closing in. Wiretaps, informants, arrests. The silence he had thrived in was breaking apart. The families were collapsing, one by one. For men like Richard, who relied on secrecy, this was disaster. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, and yet he refused to adapt. His code wouldn't allow fear. To admit fear was to admit weakness. Instead, he doubled down, more careful, more isolated, more paranoid. He began to think of his code as a kind of religion. It was the only thing that made sense in a world full of liars and traitors. He believed that as long as he stayed true to it, no emotion, no hesitation, no guilt, he would survive. It was faith in the cold. But faith built on fear is fragile. He once told a priest, during one of his rare moments of vulnerability, that he had done bad things. The priest told him to confess, to ask for forgiveness. Richard smiled and said, "I'm not sorry. I'd do it again." The priest told him that was pride talking, that God forgives even the worst sins if the sinner repents. Richard shook his head. God had a chance, he said. He gave me that father, that life. He made me what I am. He walked out before the priest could answer. That was the last time he ever stepped inside a church. His lack of remorse wasn't an act. It was the purest expression of who he'd become. He didn't regret the killings. He regretted the mistakes that made them necessary. He regretted being caught, being betrayed, being vulnerable, never the deaths themselves. If I could go back, he told an interviewer, I'd do the same. Maybe cleaner, but the same. The simplicity of that statement was what chilled everyone who heard it. Yet, even in his twisted morality, there were glimpses of conscience, moments that betrayed the possibility that some part of him still knew what he'd lost. When asked if he loved his wife, he said, yeah, in my way. When asked if his kids knew what he was, he said softly, I hope not. That hesitation, that brief drop in tone, revealed something the ice couldn't hide completely, the faint memory of the man he might have been before the violence took over. But it never lasted. The wall always went back up. The deeper he sank into his code, the more isolated he became. He stopped trusting everyone, even the men who paid him. He began testing people, watching how they reacted, looking for signs of betrayal. He'd lie just to see if others would lie back. He was no longer working for anyone. He was policing the very rules he had invented. The hunter had become a warden of his own paranoia. Every principle he followed, precision, silence, detachment, was born out of fear, not strength. But he never saw it that way. He believed it made him invincible. He told himself that emotions were for other people, that love and fear were weaknesses the strong couldn't afford. Yet everything he did was driven by the fear of losing control, of being powerless again. His code didn't protect him from his past. It repeated it in a different form. The bell had become a gun, the beatings had become hits, and the silence of his childhood had become the silence of the Iceman. As the years went on, his justifications grew thinner. The jobs became sloppier, the reasoning more fragile. He started killing for smaller reasons: paranoia, suspicion, insults. The code that once gave him order was collapsing into chaos. He told himself he was still in control, but deep down, he knew he was spiraling. Each death felt less like precision and more like panic disguised as calm. One night, during an interview from prison, a journalist asked him if he ever thought about the people he killed. Richard paused. For a moment, the mask slipped. No, he said finally. Thinking doesn't change anything. But there was a long silence after, longer than usual. Then he added, sometimes I dream about them. Not their faces, just the noise, the quiet after. It was the first and only time he admitted that silence, the thing he'd worshipped his entire life, had started to haunt him. The Iceman's code was never about honor or ethics. It was about survival. It was a man's desperate attempt to impose order on a life built from chaos. But in the end, it betrayed him. The rules that once kept him alive would lead to his downfall. His silence made him untraceable for years, but it also made him alone. His efficiency earned him money, but it also earned him enemies. And his calmness, once his greatest weapon, would one day be mistaken for trust, a mistake that would cost him everything. By the time the world began to close in on him, Richard still believed he could outthink it, outplan it, outkill it. He believed his code would save him one last time. But no code, no matter how cold, can protect a man from the weight of his own sins. He didn't know it yet, but the ice was starting to crack, not from the outside, but from within. The control that had once defined him was slipping, inch by inch. And when it finally broke, the man who believed he could kill without consequence would face the only enemy he could never silence: himself. Chapter 10. Cracks in the ice. It started small, the kind of cracks you don't notice at first. A detail overlooked here, a careless word there. For years, Richard Kuklinski had built a life around precision, silence, and control. He believed that as long as he remained calm, no one could touch him. But time has a way of wearing down even the coldest surfaces. The Mafia was changing, The streets were changing, and so was he. The Iceman who once ruled through discipline was beginning to drift. He didn't see it at first. He thought he was sharper than ever. But slowly, the cracks began to show, and the life he'd built on ice started to melt beneath his feet. The first sign was paranoia. It came quietly, like a whisper in the dark. A car following too long. A glance from a stranger that lingered too much. For years, he'd been careful, never using phones, never repeating routines. But lately, he caught himself slipping. He trusted people he shouldn't have. He cut corners. He'd begun to believe his own myth, that he was untouchable. The Mafia's ghost. The man who couldn't be caught. That illusion was comforting, but dangerous. And in the world he lived in, comfort was always the first step toward death. He began noticing tales where there were none, shadows where there was only light. He'd drive in circles for hours, checking his mirrors, testing his instincts. Sometimes he'd park on a side street and wait, just to see if anyone followed. He'd sit there, engine idling, cigarette burning low, scanning the darkness for movement. The silence he once loved now felt heavy. Too heavy. It wasn't peace anymore. It was suspicion. Every sound became a threat. Every face, a potential betrayal. The Mafia's world was falling apart around him. The 80s brought RICO laws, wiretaps, and federal cases that tore entire families to pieces. Bosses who once ruled the streets were now whispering into microphones, trading loyalty for leniency. The old code of silence was dying, and in its place came fear, the kind that spread like a virus. No one knew who was wearing a wire. No one knew who would flip next. Richard wasn't a made man, but he was connected to enough people to know what was happening. His employers were crumbling, and if the FBI couldn't reach him directly, they'd reach him through those who could. His business was shrinking too. The jobs weren't as clean, the payments not as secure. The men he worked for were paranoid, desperate, unpredictable. Some owed him money. Others suspected he was taking too much. He didn't trust them, and they didn't trust him. The balance that had kept everything running smoothly for decades was gone. The streets were filled with whispers. Who was next to go down? Who was cooperating? Who was already dead but didn't know it yet? For Richard, the cracks in his empire were mirrored by cracks at home. His wife Barbara had grown distant. She still played the role of the devoted spouse, but the fear had become constant. The bruises faded, but the silence lingered. The children were growing older, asking questions she couldn't answer. What does Dad do, they'd ask. Why does he always leave at night? Barbara didn't have the words. She'd smile, lie, and tell them their father was a businessman. But deep down, she knew the truth was closing in. Richard's temper was getting worse. The pressure of keeping both lives separate was breaking him apart. He couldn't sleep. He drank more. He'd sit alone in the kitchen at 3 a.m, staring into nothing, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Sometimes he'd drive aimlessly through the night, past the same streets, the same warehouses, the same empty lots where he'd once buried bodies. He'd look at them and feel nothing. Not guilt, not pride, just exhaustion. The ice was beginning to crack from within. He had killed too many people to remember, but some faces began to return in flashes. Not in guilt. Guilt required empathy, and he'd buried that long ago, but as fragments, like echoes of old work haunting him out of sequence. Sometimes he'd wake from dreams where he wasn't the killer, but the one being hunted. He'd feel his heart race, his breath shorten, the same fear he used to see in other men's eyes. He'd sit up, sweating, and remind himself who he was. Nobody can touch me, he'd whisper. Nobody. But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it anymore. His associates started to die. Some were found shot, others vanished completely. He told himself it was business as usual. That's what the life was. But the timing was too close, too deliberate. One by one, the circle around him tightened. There were rumors that law enforcement had a file on him, connecting his name to dozens of unsolved murders. They didn't have evidence. Not yet, but they had interest. And interest was dangerous. He became more careful, but also more desperate. He needed one big score, One job that would let him walk away, disappear, live quietly with his family. He'd talk about it sometimes with Barbara, saying he wanted to move south, maybe to Florida, open a business, leave the coal behind. She'd nod, smile faintly, pretend to believe him. But both of them knew the truth. Men like him don't retire. They either die or get caught. There's no middle ground. His paranoia turned into mistakes. He started overthinking, second-guessing himself. On one job, he waited too long, missed the opportunity, had to improvise. It worked, but it wasn't clean. The kind of error he would have mocked years earlier. The perfectionist was slipping. He'd catch himself making excuses, the weather, the timing, the traffic, but deep down, he knew the real problem wasn't external. It was him. The cold precision that once defined him was eroding under the weight of years, of fear, of too many ghosts. Even his methods began to falter. He'd once been meticulous, leaving no trace, no body, no evidence. Now he was careless. A glove left behind, a tire track not covered. He was aging, and with age came fatigue. His memory wasn't as sharp, his reflexes slower. He still believed he was invincible, but the world was moving faster than he could. The predators of his generation were being replaced by informants and businessmen. The streets weren't run by killers anymore. They were run by men with briefcases and wiretaps. He was becoming a relic, a ghost of a dying era. And then came the biggest mistake of all: trust. For a man who spent his life trusting no one, he finally did, and it would destroy him. His name was Dominic Polifrone, an undercover ATF agent who posed as a fellow hitman looking to work with him. Richard met him through a contact who vouched for him, not realizing that contact was already cooperating with law enforcement. Dominic played his part perfectly. Confident, ruthless, someone who spoke Richard's language. They bonded over their supposed trade, swapping stories, discussing methods. For once, Richard felt understood. He let his guard down, little by little. Dominic told him about a job. A simple hit, good money, no risk. The target, he said, was a businessman who owed money to some connected people. Richard agreed to do it, suggesting cyanide as the method. He even bragged about his past kills, explaining how clean and quiet cyanide was, how no one ever suspected. He thought he was talking to an ally. In reality, he was being recorded. Every word, every admission, every detail, all captured and preserved as evidence. The trap was closing, but Richard didn't see it. He was too confident in his instincts. He'd avoided capture for 30 years, survived countless close calls. He believed his own myth too deeply to imagine that anyone could outplay him. The Iceman never panicked, never hesitated, never trusted, until he did. Meanwhile, Barbara was reaching her breaking point. The fear had become unbearable. His moods were darker, his absences longer. She started thinking about leaving, but she knew what he was capable of. She'd seen flashes of that darkness too many times to risk provoking it. The house felt like a prison. Walls painted in silence, windows filled with dread. Sometimes, she'd watch him sitting at the table, staring into space, and wonder what he was thinking about. She realized one night, with a chill that froze her heart, that she didn't know who he was anymore. Maybe she never had. Richard's code of control was unraveling completely now. The paranoia that once protected him was consuming him. He carried multiple weapons everywhere, even at the grocery store. He watched his family too closely, convinced that the FBI might use them against him. Every noise outside was a threat. Every phone call could be a setup. He'd built a life around silence, and now that same silence was deafening. He continued working with Dominic, unaware that the end was near. They met several times, planning the supposed hit. On one of those meetings, Richard handed over a bottle of cyanide, explaining how to use it properly. That was the final piece the authorities needed. The evidence was clear: conspiracy to commit murder, possession of lethal poison, admission to multiple killings. The case against him was complete. On December 17, 1986, after years of silence, the ice finally broke. The FBI, ATF, and New Jersey State Police coordinated a massive operation to arrest him. They followed him from his house early that morning, waiting for the right moment. As he stopped at a red light, agents surrounded his car, guns drawn, voices shouting. His wife was with him. For a moment, he didn't move. He just looked straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel, expression calm, almost peaceful. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. The man who had controlled every moment of his life for decades was finally out of control. Barbara watched as they dragged him out of the car, pinned him to the ground, and cuffed him. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stared. In that instant, the illusion shattered. The husband, the father, the protector, all gone. The mask she'd lived with for 25 years was ripped away, and beneath it was the Iceman, cold, still defeated. As the agents led him away, he looked back once at his wife. No words, no emotion. Just a stare, empty, unreadable, final. The silence that had always protected him now sealed him off completely. For the first time, he wasn't in control of it. The cracks that had begun as whispers had finally split wide open. The Iceman's empire of silence had collapsed under its own weight. The man who had lived by control was undone by trust. The killer who prided himself on never making mistakes had made the biggest one of all, believing he was beyond consequence. And as the doors of the patrol car closed, cutting off the last sliver of light, the world around him exhaled. The ghost had finally been caught. The ice had melted, and beneath it, there was nothing left but a man who thought he could outsmart death, until death finally caught up with him. Chapter 11. The Undercover Trap. It was the sort of trap that could only be built by patience and illusion. A slow tightening of a noose woven from flattery, shared language, and the dangerous currency of mutual respect. For years, Richard Kuklinski had been a ghost, a rumor stitched together from unsolved corpses and whispered threats. He'd survived on anonymity, on the faith that silence protects the guilty. What he hadn't counted on was someone pretending to be his mirror, a man who would echo his talk, mimic his methods, and hand him the very thing he prized most, trust. That man was the bait, and for once, the Iceman would be the one to walk into a trap he couldn't control. The undercover agent didn't look like a saint or a cop. He looked like business, quiet, competent, maybe even dangerous enough to be useful. He introduced himself with the right kind of swagger and the right kind of lie. He spoke the language of work that needed doing, of debts, of clean solutions. He hinted at a past that matched the darkness Kuklinski knew how to value. Experience, efficiency, no questions asked. He didn't offer friendship. He offered a contract and the tacit understanding that silence was the highest payment. That's what made him convincing. That's what made Kuklinski listen. They met in safe places, diners with booth corners and low lighting, used car lots where conversations could die in the hum of an idling engine, anonymous motels with beige walls and no witnesses. The agent was careful. He let Kuklinski talk first. He laughed at the right jokes, asked the right follow-ups, feigned admiration for the craft. That mirror worked. Conversation filled gaps. Layers of guardedness thinned. It's a simple thing. When someone finally hears you describe your own darkness without recoiling, you feel understood, and understanding is the most dangerous kind of permission. Kuklinski, who had spent decades guarding himself like a vault, began to open. He described methods as if reciting a manual. The way cyanide worked, the feel of a neck when the heart still kicked, the way freezers changed the chemistry of a corpse. He spoke of past jobs without dates, of men who deserved it, of nights when he'd come home smelling like another world. When the undercover man nodded, when he asked for detail, Kuklinski gave it. He wasn't confessing into a void. He was trading stories with a man who, in his view, could be trusted because he sounded like the same breed of ghost. Everything they said between them was being recorded, tiny betrayals against a confidence that had thrived on secrecy. The microphones captured jokes and the soft clink of coffee cups. They caught Kuklinski's voice when he moved from generalities to specifics. The recordings would later be played in court like autopsies of a lie, threads of speech that, taken together, formed a rope around the neck of a man who had always believed he was smarter than the rest. The undercover operation did not begin as a moral crusade or a dramatic sting for headlines. It began because investigators had a pile of unsolved cases with the same cold signature: clean deaths, no witnesses, bodies that seemed to have been handled by hands who knew more than they should. Detectives saw patterns, a methodical mind behind the murders, someone comfortable with cyanide, someone who understood the value of time and refrigeration. They started to connect dots and realize that those dots might point to one man who could shift from suburban father to mafia contractor with terrifying ease. But proving it required more than conjecture. It required someone who could speak the language and be trusted enough to hear the truth. Entrapment is a word with rough edges, and it always hangs in the air around cases like this. Critics would later suggest the possibility that a man might be coaxed into confessing more than he actually did, that an agent could steer a conversation in a dangerous territory. But in the early stages, the agents weren't trying to create a monster out of nowhere. They were trying to find whether the whispers held water. Kuklinski did not need invention. His admissions were not imaginative. They were specific, details about the placement of bodies, the taste of methods, the existence of freezers. The trap was less a fabrication than a revelation. A controlled space where what had been secret could be heard, recorded, and matched to the physical evidence investigators had already collected. One of the most damning pieces of a sting was the exchange over cyanide. Kuklinski spoke about cyanide with a practitioner's reverence, describing delivery methods and concentrations. The undercover man, playing the perfect client, asked for instruction. Kuklinski obliged. He produced a small bottle, explained how to dilute it, how to hide it in a breath spray or perfume bottle, how fast the effects came. He wasn't merely boasting. He was teaching. That moment, handing over lethal knowledge and a vial to a man conceived as an ally, would later read in court like a contract signed in blood. It's tempting, when watching or hearing about it, to imagine a single dramatic meeting, the moment the trap snaps. But real life rarely builds in neat peaks. Instead, it's the accumulation of small acts, the soft nods, the shared cigarettes, the jokes that reduce suspicion into smiling complacency. The undercover agent's genius was in the long game. He didn't rush Kuklinski. He let him perform. A killer who likes to perform is a killer who will unguard for the applause. That unguarding gave detectives the kind of evidence that can survive cross-examination. Not a single boastful statement, but a chorus of consistent claims matched to physical possibilities. Still, even with recordings and a supposed vial of poison, getting from suspicion to arrest required more than bravado. Investigators had to corroborate. They searched freezers, warehouses, properties associated with Kuklinski's network. They checked financial flows, traced envelopes and drop points, interviewed acquaintances who spoke of the man who disappeared for days and came back with cash. Each corroboration was a chisel stroke on a statue of suspicion until the image of guilt became undeniable. The law was not a single wiretap conversation, but an accumulation of converging facts. The psychological dimensions of the operation are worth dwelling on, not to exonerate or condemn the tactics, but to understand why Kuklinski fell for it. A professional killer who has lived by silence becomes addicted to the feeling of being the only one in the room who knows the truth. When someone else leans in and suggests they know, too, it flatters the ego. It validates the code he built his life around. In Kuklinski's case, the lure was, in part, the demonstration that there were still men who required his services and would pay handsomely for them. The business of murder had been his identity as much as his occupation. The man pretending to be an ally made that identity feel recognized. That recognition was pleasure. Pleasure breeds risk. There were practical errors, too. Kinship with other criminals is a fragile currency. Patrons and introducers who once vouched for him had been turned by the pressure of investigation or the prospect of a lighter sentence. A contact who suggested the undercover man to Kuklinski may have believed they were moving a problem away, But what they actually did was place a false mirror in front of a man who had spent 3 decades admiring only his reflection. Trust in that world is never free. It is bought, traded, or leveraged. And in this case, it was manipulated into evidence. As details accrued, the net tightened. Investigators watched Kuklinski's comings and goings. They tracked the envelopes, the cars, the itineraries. The arrest plan was surgical. They did not want a messy spectacle that could alert others or spark violence. So they waited for a moment when Kuklinski would be alone and vulnerable, or at least when his guard would be down enough that force could be brought to bear with minimal risk. On a cold morning in December, as he moved through the small rituals of everyday life, the mundane errands, the short drive, officers closed in. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. But the trap's success didn't end the questions. In the courtroom, defense attorneys picked at the edges. Was Kuklinski boasting? Were some confessions exaggerated? Did the possibility of entrapment taint the evidence? Those arguments mattered because the justice system demands proof beyond the thrill of a recording. Prosecutors had to prove not only that Kuklinski had spoken of crimes, but that what he confessed matched physical realities. Unexplained bodies, forensic possibilities, corroborative testimony. The undercover tapes were like keys. The other evidence was the lock they opened. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. Some saw the sting as a triumph, a careful, patient law enforcement operation that put a ruthless killer behind bars. Others wondered if the state had earned its victory by dancing on the edge of moral compromise. Was coaxing a confession from a man skilled at lying the same as creating one? The debate played out in columns and late-night conversations. But these moral questions rarely eased the pain of those who had lost family members, nor did they restore the lives that had been ended by methods the Iceman had once refined. For Kuklinski himself, the trap was a personal humiliation wrapped in inevitability. He had prided himself on being untraceable, on owning silence like armor. To be undone by a voice that sounded like his own was an irony he would never publicly acknowledge. There was bruised pride in the footage of his interactions. A man who had once controlled rooms suddenly exposed as someone who could be led. The image cut deeper than the handcuffs. If you've ever watched a creature at the top of its food chain realize that a new predator has learned its scent, you'll understand the smallness that must have consumed him in those last private seconds before arrest. Yet the trap also revealed a truth more disturbing than any single moral debate. He was not an immaculately efficient phantom. He was a man with habits, with vanity, with the same human weaknesses that topple empires. The undercover operation didn't invent those weaknesses. It exploited them. It turned the one thing he prized, trust earned from men who shared his darkness, into the instrument of his capture. When the case moved forward, the tapes provided prosecutors with the kind of material juries respond to: unvarnished speech from the perpetrator himself, recorded in his own voice, explaining his methods, and sometimes admitting to deeds that matched missing persons and unsolved homicides. Investigators walked jurors through maps, timelines, and corroborated evidence, stitching the recorded boasts into a broader tapestry of proof. The defense tried to unweave it, pointing to the agent's manipulation and claiming the defendant had, at times, wandered into fantasy. But a pattern of cold specifics is hard to deny. Details about bodies frozen for weeks, disposal methods unique enough to stand out, and exchanges about cyanide that corresponded to anomalies in the medical examinations of certain victims. The operation also revealed another ugly fragment of the underworld: the transactional nature of violence. He hadn't killed out of ideology or conviction. He had been a vendor of finality. The undercover agent, whether called hero or pragmatist, simply entered the marketplace and negotiated. In doing so, law enforcement exposed a structural truth: that organized violence, like any business, can be interrupted when the buyers and sellers are identified and their communications severed. There is always a human after the spectacle, though: a wife whose illusions crumple, children who must reconcile the memory of a father with horror, neighbors who replay every mundane moment, trying to see the one that should have told them the truth. The Undercover Trap did what it was meant to do. It replaced rumor with evidence, whispers with recorded words, fear with the machinery of the law. But it did not erase the damage. It only made it prosecutable. As the chapter of trust and betrayal closed, one question kept echoing in the background like a footstep in an empty hallway. How many more ghosts lived like him, walking through the garden, gating suburban life for monstrous work? The undercover agent had caught one, a man who'd lived long enough to think himself invincible. But the operation was never meant to be a rite of absolution. It was a blunt tool in a long fight. For Kuklinski, the trap ended his freedom. For the families, it started a slow process of answers. For the Mafia, it was a warning that the shadows could be mapped. And for the world watching, it was a reminder that even legends of silence can be undone by a single voice pretending to agree. And still, even as law closed around him, even as recordings echoed in courtrooms and headlines blared his fall, there lingered the chilling question that no tape could fully resolve. How many times had he been truly honest? And how many times had he been performing? The line between confession and boast would be argued for years, but the tape remained. A man, calm as ever, explaining how he made others disappear. The trap had worked, but the truth it captured was slippery, raw, and not yet finished telling its story. Chapter 12. The Arrest and the Silence. The morning Richard Kuklinski was arrested was gray, cold, and strangely ordinary. He left his house like he had 1,000 times before, jacket zipped, movement steady, eyes scanning out of habit but not suspicion. To anyone watching, he looked like a man running errands, not a man moments away from the collapse of everything he'd ever built. The wind bit against his face as he slid behind the wheel of his car, and for a brief second, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't see fear there, or guilt, or even worry. He saw control, that old armor he'd worn for decades. But beneath it, cracks had begun to form. The operation had been planned with surgical precision. Dozens of agents were positioned throughout the area, ATF, FBI, and New Jersey State Police, all waiting for the command. They tracked his movements for weeks, learning his patterns, knowing when his guard was lowest. He'd become predictable, and for a man who'd spent his life surviving on unpredictability, that was the fatal flaw. When the signal came, the convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled in like a silent tide. Engines low, radios crackling. By the time Kuklinski realized what was happening, it was already over. The first agent to reach him shouted his name. Not the one he used in the streets, but his full name, the kind only law enforcement and birth certificates use. Richard Leonard Kuklinski. The sound cut through the air like a blade. Guns drawn, doors flung open, the routine chaos of an arrest executed perfectly. He didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. He simply turned his head, glanced at the man pointing the gun, and exhaled. His wife sat beside him, frozen, her hands trembling on her lap. One moment, they were on their way to breakfast. The next, the world had shifted under them. When they pulled him from the car, the cold pavement pressed against his knees, his breath rising in small clouds. The cuffs clicked tight around his wrists, a sound he'd heard before, but always from a distance, always belonging to someone else. This time, it was his turn. The Iceman had finally melted, if only on the surface. But even then, there was something unsettling about his composure. Most men in his position shouted, pleaded, cursed. Richard simply stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing. One of the arresting officers would later say, "It was like cuffing a statue. You couldn't tell if he was angry or amused." Barbara sat in the car as agents surrounded her. She didn't ask what was happening. She didn't have to. The truth she'd been avoiding for years had just been dragged into the light. And in that light, there was no escape. She thought of every late night, every unexplainable bruise, every envelope of cash. She had known, deep down. But knowing and admitting are two different things. Now, there was no difference at all. The mask her husband had worn so carefully had shattered, and behind it was something colder than she'd ever imagined. They transported him in silence. Inside the car, the air was heavy with the hum of engines and the faint metallic rattle of his handcuffs. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't protest his innocence. When the agents glanced at him through the rearview mirror, he looked back, his expression blank but not defeated. It was as if he were studying them, cataloging faces the way he used to catalog victims. Even in chains, he radiated control. But the silence that had protected him for decades was no longer power. It was evidence. At headquarters, they processed him like any other suspect. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork, the standard ritual of stripping a man of identity. The fluorescent lights were harsh, clinical, making every crease on his face look deeper, every gray hair stand out like a confession of age. When they read him his rights, he nodded. "Do you understand?" An officer asked. "Yes," he said softly. That was all. No bravado, no denial. Just acknowledgement, not of guilt, but of inevitability. Meanwhile, the news spread fast. Television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking reports. The man known as the Iceman, suspected of dozens of contract killings, has been arrested in New Jersey. Neighbors gathered outside the Kuklinski home, whispering in disbelief. The man who shoveled their driveways, who waved good morning, who played with his kids in the yard. A hitman? It didn't make sense. But then the details trickled out, and disbelief turned into fascination. The quiet man next door had been living two lives, and the world couldn't look away. Interrogations began almost immediately. The agents wanted confessions, corroboration, closure. For days, they questioned him, shifting strategies, intimidation, empathy, silence. He matched each one effortlessly. When they pressed him about specific murders, he shrugged. When they accused him of lying, he smiled faintly. "You'll have to prove it," he'd say. It wasn't arrogance. It was fact. For 30 years, no one had been able to. He knew how the game worked. Words were currency, and he wasn't about to spend his. But the undercover recordings changed everything. They played back his own voice describing cyanide, disposal methods, frozen corpses. The tone was unmistakable, calm, instructive, detached. Listening to himself, he showed no reaction, no flicker of recognition or regret, just silence. It was as if he were hearing someone else speak. One agent leaned across the table and said, "That's you, Richard. We've got you." He looked at the tape recorder, then back at the agent, and said, "Everybody's got somebody." The psychological wall he'd built around himself was strong, but the cracks were deepening. In private moments, away from the interrogators, he began talking, not confessions, exactly, but reflections. He spoke about loyalty, about betrayal, about the stupidity of trusting people. If you want something done right, he said, you do it yourself. He spoke about killing with the same tone most men reserve for fixing a leaky faucet. It wasn't cruelty. It was indifference, the kind that chills you more than rage ever could. They offered him deals, reduced sentences for cooperation. He refused. "I don't make deals," he said. "I make decisions." It was the same logic that had guided his life. Even now, surrounded by walls, cameras, and guards, he believed he was still in control. But control was an illusion. The recordings, the witnesses, the evidence, they were all pieces of a puzzle he couldn't rearrange. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the power. Barbara visited once, early in the process. The meeting was short, awkward, heavy with words left unsaid. She sat across from him, separated by glass, holding the phone to her ear with trembling hands. He stared at her, expressionless. "Why?" she asked, voice breaking. "Why all of it?" He paused, then said, "It's just what I was good at." She started to cry. He didn't move, didn't flinch. When the guards signaled the end of the visit, he placed the phone down gently, stood up, and walked away. He never saw her again. In custody, he became something between a spectacle and a study. Reporters wanted interviews. Psychologists wanted analysis. Everyone wanted to understand how a man could live two lives so perfectly divided. The answer was simpler than they expected. He believed in compartments. Work was work, family was family, and one never touched the other. To him, morality was a myth. The world wasn't divided into good and evil. It was divided into predators and prey. He just happened to be the former. The state built its case methodically, piece by piece. They didn't need all his crimes. They just needed enough. Enough to show a pattern, to prove intent, to break the myth of the untouchable Iceman. The trial was less about guilt and more about spectacle. The prosecution painted him as a monster, a cold-blooded executioner who killed for money and pride. The defense tried to argue exaggeration, that he'd embellish stories to impress the undercover agent. But the tapes were too precise, the evidence too damning. As the proceedings dragged on, Richard sat through them with eerie calm. When witnesses spoke about bodies, about families torn apart, he stared straight ahead, unblinking. When the jury entered, he nodded politely. He treated the entire process like another job, something to endure, not something to feel. The verdict, when it came, didn't surprise him. Guilty. Life imprisonment without parole. The words hung in the courtroom like a final breath of winter. He showed no reaction, no outburst, no plea. Just that same faint smile that had unnerved everyone who ever met him. As guards led him out, reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret it?" One called. Richard paused, looked toward the noise, and said, "Regret is for people who care." Then he disappeared down the hallway, swallowed by the machinery of justice. Inside prison, the silence followed him like an old friend. The walls didn't bother him. The routines didn't break him. In some twisted way, confinement suited him. It stripped the world of unpredictability. Everything happened on schedule. No surprises, no betrayals. For the first time, his environment matched his inner landscape. Cold, measured, still. He became a legend among inmates, a ghost even in daylight. Some feared him. Others sought him out, drawn by the myth. He kept to himself, always polite, always distant. Years later, when journalists and documentarians came calling, he agreed to talk. Not for money, not for sympathy, but because he seemed to enjoy the attention. Or maybe he simply saw it as another performance. On camera, he was chillingly composed. He described murders with detail, but no remorse, speaking as though recounting a day's work. When asked what it felt like to take a life, he said, "It felt like nothing, maybe less than nothing." In those interviews, he revealed pieces of himself he'd never shown before, not because he was confessing, but because he wanted the last word. He spoke of his father's beatings, his mother's cruelty, his belief that the world was always out to hurt him first. "I learned early," he said, "if you don't hurt them, they'll hurt you." It wasn't an excuse, but an explanation, the twisted logic of a man who built his identity on dominance. By the time the interviews ended, he was older, slower, his body betraying the calm his voice never lost. Yet even then, his words carried the same chill. When asked if he believed in hell, he smirked. "If there's a hell," he said, "I'll find a way to run it." The arrest that morning had ended a 30-year reign of terror, but it hadn't changed the man. The Iceman who stepped into prison was the same one who stepped out of his house that cold December morning. Composed, deliberate, unrepentant. The only difference was the walls around him. And as the years passed, the legend grew. Books, documentaries, interviews. Everyone trying to decode the mind of a man who lived without conscience. But maybe there was nothing to decode. Maybe the truth was as simple and as terrifying as it seemed. Richard Kuklinski didn't feel what others felt. He didn't fear, didn't love, didn't regret. He existed in the hollow space between emotion and logic, a place most people can't survive. The arrest was the end of his freedom, but it was also his final victory over the illusion of control. For once, the silence wasn't his choice. It was absolute. The world had taken his voice, his movement, his business. And yet, In that stillness, in that prison cell, he was finally surrounded by something that matched him perfectly, a world made of concrete and quiet. The ice had cracked, but it had never melted. It had only hardened into something permanent, eternal, and as cold as the man himself. Chapter 13. Life Behind Bars. The sound of the metal gate sliding shut was unlike anything Richard Kuklinski had ever heard before. It wasn't just a noise, it was a declaration. A wall between two worlds, one he'd controlled and one he'd never escape. He had walked through hundreds of doors in his life, warehouse doors, motel doors, car doors, but this one was different. This one didn't open again. He stood there in the fluorescent light of Trenton State Prison, the chains around his wrists clinking softly as guards led him to his new reality. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the predator. He was just another man in a cage. Prison is a strange place for men like him. For killers without conscience, it's both punishment and peace. Out there, control is a battle. In here, it's a system. Every day follows rules. The lights go on, the doors open, the food is served, the count is made. No one has to decide who lives or dies. It's already decided. In that routine, Richard found something almost comforting. There was no chaos, no betrayal, no surprises. Just concrete, steel, and silence. It was the perfect habitat for the Iceman. He adjusted quickly. The other inmates watched him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They'd heard the stories, how he killed hundreds, how he froze bodies to hide time of death, how he was trusted by the Mafia. Rumors turned him into legend before he even set foot in the yard. Some wanted to test him. Others wanted to stand near him, as if his reputation could protect them. But Richard wasn't there to play prison politics. He kept to himself, quiet but not weak, polite but never soft. The guards respected that. The inmates learned to leave him alone. Inside those walls, he became what he had always been, a ghost that walked in daylight. He didn't join gangs or take sides. He didn't talk unless he had to. He followed the routine like a machine. Breakfast at 6, yard at 9, lunch at noon, lockdown at 4, dinner at 6, lights out at 10. Day after day, year after year, it was the same. Time didn't move in prison. It repeated. For most men, that repetition drove them mad. For Richard, it was balance. After a lifetime of chaos, monotony was a kind of peace. But even in that stillness, he wasn't entirely alone. There were interviews, psychiatrists, journalists, people fascinated by his story. They wanted to understand what went on inside the mind of a man who could kill without feeling. He didn't mind the attention. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it. Sitting in a folding chair, dressed in a beige jumpsuit, he spoke into microphones with the same detached calm he used when describing the weather. It was business, he'd say. That's all. Just business. In those interviews, he became almost performative, playing the role of the unflinching monster the world expected. The camera lights reflected off his glasses as he talked about cyanide and freezing corpses, about the mechanics of murder. But behind the calm, there was something else, an old man reciting the only thing that ever gave his life meaning. Killing was the one skill he'd mastered, the one thing that separated him from the faceless crowd. Now, stripped of that identity, he clung to the legend. The Iceman wasn't just his nickname anymore. It was his armor, his mask, his last illusion of control. Psychologists who spoke to him described a man without empathy, but not without thought. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't insane. He was deliberate, a sociopath who understood his own condition but didn't see it as wrong. When asked if he believed in good or evil, he'd shrug. It's all the same, he'd say. People do what they have to do. That sentence defined him. The line between survival and cruelty had vanished long ago. In his mind, killing wasn't evil. It was necessity, cold, logical, inevitable. Inside the cell, his life shrank to a small world. A bed, a toilet, a table, a shelf of books. He read constantly. History, crime, philosophy, even religion. Not because he believed in redemption, but because he liked understanding power. He studied men who ruled empires, who waged wars, who justified blood with ideology. In a way, he saw himself reflected in them, a man who did terrible things because he could. One of the guards once said, "He read like a man looking for a reason to stay calm." Maybe he was. Letters arrived from strangers, fans, admirers, curious minds. Some wanted to know how he did it. Others wanted to know why. He rarely responded. When he did, the replies were short, polite, detached. He didn't brag. He didn't apologize. He just told fragments of truth, enough to keep people guessing. He'd write, "Some things are better left unsaid." That phrase would become a signature of sorts, a reminder that even locked away, he still controlled what people knew about him. Over time, the prison began to feel less like punishment and more like reflection. For a man who'd spent his life hiding behind noise and motion, the silence became a mirror. Whether he liked it or not, the ghosts he'd buried started to return, not as remorse, but as recognition. He would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, remembering faces. Not their names, not their pleas, just faces. They flickered like static, fading as quickly as they appeared. In those moments, something human almost surfaced, but it never stayed long enough to matter. His family visited less and less. Barbara had moved on, raising the children quietly, keeping the name, but not the memory. The kids grew up, started their own lives, carrying the weight of their father's infamy like a curse they hadn't asked for. Sometimes they wrote to him, short letters filled with polite distance. He'd respond with careful words, pride disguised as detachment. He loved them, in his way, but even that love was filtered through control. He wanted them to be strong, unbreakable, cold. He didn't realize that what they needed was warmth. Prison, in its strange way, began to age him faster than time itself. His health declined, diabetes, heart trouble, high blood pressure. He started moving slower, speaking softer. The man who had once carried bodies like sacks of flour now struggled to climb the stairs to the infirmary. But even in weakness, he refused pity. When doctors urged him to rest, he'd wave them off. "I've rested enough," he said. The same defiance that had kept him alive now kept him from accepting that his body was surrendering. In his later years, he became reflective in interviews, not remorseful, but more open. He spoke about his father, about beatings that shaped him, about the moment he realized pain could be power. "I learned early that fear controls people better than love," he said once, almost to himself. That sentence hung in the air, heavy and hollow. It wasn't a confession. It was a diagnosis. He understood what he was, but he never saw a reason to be anything else. Even the guards, hardened men used to the worst humanity had to offer, felt an uneasy fascination with him. Some described him as polite and cooperative, others as chillingly indifferent. One recalled bringing him food and hearing him say, "Thank you," with perfect manners, then add quietly, "You know, in another life, I might have been a chef." They laughed, unsure if he was joking. That was the unsettling part about him. He could blur the line between sincerity and threats so easily that you never knew which side you were standing on. There were moments of humanity, small and strange. He befriended a stray cat that wandered near the exercise yard. He'd feed it bits of bread, talk to it softly. "You're smarter than most people I've met," he once told the cat, half smiling. The guards watched from a distance, wondering what the gesture meant. Was it sentiment, or was it control, the act of taming something weaker just to remind himself he still could? With Richard, it was impossible to tell. He continued to speak with journalists over the years, granting interviews that blurred the line between confession and performance. Each one added another layer to the legend. The more he talked, the more the myth grew. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was an archetype, the calm, cold predator who could look into a camera and describe death without blinking. People were horrified and captivated at the same time. He had become what he always wanted to be, unforgettable. But prison doesn't keep secrets. Over time, the legend faded, replaced by the mundane reality of age. His hair turned white. His shoulders slumped. The Iceman was melting, not from guilt, but from time. He started spending more days in the infirmary, hooked up to machines that hummed softly in the background. When nurses checked his pulse, he joked, still cold. Even in decline, he never let go of the persona. It was the only truth he'd ever trusted. In his final years, he found himself thinking about faith, not because he believed, but because he wanted to understand why others did. He met with a prison chaplain, not to confess, but to debate. "If there's a God," he said, "he's worse than me. He made me this way." The chaplain told him that God offers forgiveness to those who seek it. Richard shook his head. "I don't need forgiveness," he said. "I need quiet." The quiet, in the end, was all he had. The world outside forgot him. The Mafia barely remembered him, and the people he once terrified had either died or moved on. He was a relic of a different era, a ghost locked in concrete, living among men half his age who saw him as myth, not man. He'd watched them from his cell window, new inmates arriving, loud and scared, thinking they were untouchable. Chapter 14. The Mind of the Iceman. If there is one question that haunted everyone who ever studied Richard Kuklinski, it was this: what went on inside his mind? How could a man be both father and executioner, gentle one moment and monstrous the next? What made him feel nothing where others would break apart from guilt or grief? Psychologists, criminologists, priests, and journalists all try to find the answer, but each left with a different conclusion, as if his mind were a maze that swallowed explanations whole. Even now, long after his death, his thoughts remain like frozen glass, clear enough to see through, yet impossible to touch without shattering. The human mind builds walls to protect itself from pain. For Kuklinski, those walls became his entire personality. He had learned early that feelings were weaknesses, that fear was a weapon others used against you. As a child, he had cried once, just once, when his father beat him until his brother lay lifeless on the floor. The look of disgust on his father's face that night carved itself into him. He decided then that emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He buried it so deep that it stopped being part of him. Decades later, when asked if he ever cried again, he said, "Only once, when my father died, because I didn't get to do it myself." The answer wasn't bravado. It was truth spoken without shame. For him, the absence of feeling was not a problem to be fixed. It was proof that he'd evolved beyond weakness. Psychologists who met him inside Trenton State Prison describe an intelligence both chilling and lucid. He could dissect his own behavior like a scientist explaining the behavior of an insect. He knew he was different, but he didn't see it as disorder. When one psychiatrist told him he met all the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, he smiled slightly and said, "I guess that means I'm consistent." He was polite during evaluations, even charming at times, answering questions without hesitation. But beneath that civility was an awareness of power. He liked knowing that the people who came to analyze him would leave unsettled. "They all want to understand," he once said, "but understanding doesn't make them safe." Inside his mind, morality was arithmetic. Life and death were numbers, outcomes, results. If someone crossed a line, they were subtracted. It was clean and efficient. The complexity came not from whether an act was right or wrong, but from whether it was necessary. That's how he justified everything, from small betrayals to murders that stretched across decades. The logic was mechanical, precise, unflinching. When he killed, he didn't imagine families grieving or funerals being held. He imagined problems being solved. "I didn't see people," he said. "I saw situations." It was a phrase that became the key to decoding his mind, the replacement of humanity with function. Some killers are driven by impulse, others by thrill. Richard was driven by purpose. Every act of violence had a reason, even if that reason existed only in his head. To him, chaos was weakness. He hated people who acted out of rage. He once said, "I didn't lose control. Ever. That's what made me good at it." He believed control was proof of superiority, and murder was simply the highest form of control. When you could take a life without hesitation, you proved that nothing owned you. Not fear, not guilt, not emotion. That belief was his religion. But even control can become a prison. Over time, the calm that defined him turned into emptiness. The psychologists who studied him described it as emotional flatline. No highs, no lows, just a steady line across every experience. Whether he was talking about his child's birth or a man he'd strangled, his tone was identical. He didn't raise his voice, didn't change expression. It wasn't an act. It was who he had become, a man stripped of emotional rhythm. One doctor wrote, "He has feelings the way a reptile has heat, responsive only to external conditions." When interviewers pushed him to describe what killing felt like, his answers were mechanical. It depended on the job, he'd say. Sometimes it was quick. Sometimes it took longer. Either way, it ended the same. When asked if he ever felt pity, he said, "For who? They'd have done the same to me if I didn't get there first." That justification, them or me, was the thread that ran through his entire life. It was his version of morality, a mirror image of survival instinct distorted by violence. He wasn't delusional. He never claimed voices told him what to do. He never blamed God, the devil, or fate. He blamed no one because he didn't believe in blame. He believed in choice. Everything he did because he chose to. That self-awareness made him even more terrifying. You can pity madness. You can't pity conviction. "I never killed for fun," he once said. "But I can't say I didn't enjoy the quiet after." That quiet was the part most people never understood. It wasn't the killing that fascinated him. It was the stillness that followed, the absence of struggle, the total control of a world that, for one instant, stopped moving at his command. Doctors noted something else. He showed no physiological signs of anxiety when describing murder. His pulse stayed normal. His pupils didn't dilate. His breathing never changed. It was as if his body had trained itself not to react. That calm was what made him successful, but it also made him alien. Normal people flinch at violence. He studied it. Normal people feel dread. He felt curiosity. He once told a prison psychologist, "I like to see how people changed when they knew it was over. You can see the truth in their eyes then." For him, that final moment, the moment when fear stripped away pretense, was the only time people were real. Every prison therapist tried to find cracks in his armor, some sign of guilt or self-reflection. They never found any. The closest he came was when he spoke about his children. "I didn't want them to be like me," he said once. "But I didn't know how to show them anything else." That sentence, quiet and almost accidental, revealed something the rest of his words never did. An acknowledgement that somewhere, buried under decades of ice, there was a man who once wanted to be something better. But even that glimmer of humanity vanished quickly. "They'll be fine," he said afterward. "They're strong." And just like that, the wall went back up. The prison staff noticed a strange duality in him. With officers, he was courteous, even deferential. He followed orders without complaint. But there was always an edge, an invisible tension that filled the air when he entered a room. You could never forget what he'd done, and neither could he. He carried his past like a shadow that never left the floor. Inmates respected him, but they also avoided him. No one wanted to see what happened if he decided to remind them who he really was. In therapy sessions, he often turned the tables, analyzing the psychologists instead. He'd ask them personal questions about their families, their fears, their beliefs. Not to intimidate them, but to understand them. He was still studying people, even in captivity. He once told a counselor, "You're all trying to figure me out, but I've been figuring people out my whole life. You just use different words for it." That insight was disturbingly accurate. His ability to read people had kept him alive for decades. In prison, it became his only form of freedom. What made him unique wasn't the number of people he killed. It was the clarity with which he understood himself. Most killers hide behind stories, claiming impulse or trauma. Richard didn't hide. He didn't deny. He explained. He turned murder into logic, stripped of emotion, reduced to cause and effect. When he said, it needed to be done, he meant in the same way someone might talk about paying bills or fixing a car. It was a task, not a sin. That kind of detachment is rare, and it fascinated the world because it revealed a truth most people don't want to face. Empathy is not guaranteed. Some people simply don't have it. One psychiatrist compared him to a machine that had learned to mimic humanity without ever understanding it. He could smile, tell jokes, even offer sympathy, but it was all mechanical. "I knew what people expected," Richard said. "You smile when they smile. You frown when they cry. It's not hard. People are predictable." It was a chilling observation, the idea that empathy could be faked so perfectly that no one would know the difference. That's how he'd lived for years, blending into neighborhoods, into family life, into the illusion of normalcy. In one rare interview toward the end of his life, a journalist asked him if he believed he was evil. He paused, leaned back in his chair, and smiled faintly. "Evil," he repeated. "That's a word people use when they don't understand something. I'm not evil. I'm just me." Then he looked straight into the camera and said, "We all got our thing. Mine just happened to be this." The interviewer later said that moment felt like looking into a void that stared back without malice, without warmth, without end. To study his mind was to confront a truth about human nature, how easily survival can twist into destruction, how thin the line is between order and cruelty. Richard wasn't born a killer. He was built into one. Violence was his education, pain his language. He learned that love could hit harder than a fist, that silence could hurt more than words. By the time he became a man, he no longer saw any difference between protection and punishment. He treated murder the way his parents had treated discipline: necessary, unpleasant, final. And yet, for all his darkness, there was a strange consistency to his logic. He didn't betray his code, flawed as it was. He didn't kill women or children. He didn't torture for pleasure. He didn't beg or bargain when caught. Even in captivity, he followed the same rule that had defined his life: control everything you can, ignore everything you can't. To the end, he lived by that law. When his health failed and doctors wanted to keep him alive, he told them to pull the plug. "My choice," he said, "always mine." In death, as in life, he remained inscrutable. No tears, no remorse, no last words of wisdom, just silence. And maybe that was his final statement, that the human mind, no matter how deeply examined, will always keep its secrets. That some men aren't born to be understood. They're born to remind the rest of us what understanding can't fix. The mind of the Iceman was not chaos. It was order, stripped of mercy. It was logic without soul, discipline without empathy, control without purpose. He had built it from pain and sustained it with fear, until nothing human remained but the shape of it. And when it finally went quiet, when his heart stopped and the machines went still, the silence he left behind was not peace. It was a question, one that still lingers in the air. How close could any of us come to becoming him, if pushed far enough, hurt long enough, frozen deep enough? That question, perhaps more than the man himself, is what will never stop haunting the world. Because somewhere inside every human being lies the capacity for cruelty, and in Richard Kuklinski, that capacity was all that survived. Chapter 15, The Legacy of Fear. Time has a way of turning monsters into myths. When Richard Kuklinski died, the world didn't sigh in relief. It leaned in closer. Reporters, filmmakers, psychologists, even casual viewers who stumbled across his interviews couldn't stop watching him. There was something magnetic about the calm in his voice, the way he spoke of death as if it were weather, a natural inconvenience rather than a moral tragedy. The Iceman was gone, but his presence lingered in every question he left behind. What makes a man like that? And could the same darkness ever exist in someone who looks just like us? In the years after his death, his story became a strange kind of legend. Documentaries aired on late-night television, books filled shelves, and interviews circulated endlessly online. His calm stare from across the table, those steady eyes behind thick glasses, became an image burned into popular culture. Viewers didn't see a monster frothing with rage. They saw a man who looked ordinary, sounded intelligent, and smiled while describing murder. That was what terrified people most. Not his violence, but his normalcy. He didn't look like evil. He looked like anyone. Prisons are full of loud men, men who brag about their crimes and inflate their reputations to survive. But Richard had never needed noise. His silence did the work for him. Even in death, that silence spread. It became the echo that defined his legacy. The Iceman wasn't remembered for his brutality alone, but for the calm that wrapped around it, a calm that made people realize how fragile the boundaries of humanity truly are. Every person who watched his interviews could feel it, the disquieting possibility that emotion isn't what keeps us moral, but what keeps us human. Without it, anyone could freeze. His case became required reading in criminology courses. Professors dissected his recorded confessions, his psychological evaluations, his family background. They called him a textbook example of an antisocial personality, a perfect storm of childhood trauma, learned violence, and total emotional detachment. But the textbook explanations never felt enough. There was always something more elusive in him, something that didn't fit neatly into a diagnosis. He wasn't chaotic or impulsive. He wasn't driven by addiction or greed. He was deliberate, controlled. He could live decades pretending to be normal, fooling even himself. That's what made him dangerous beyond measure. Students who studied him often walked away unsettled, not because of the crimes themselves, but because of the questions they raised about empathy. Could someone live an entire life without feeling? Could a man be both loving and lethal, kind and cruel, depending only on which version of himself was needed? Richard had proved the answer was yes. He was a paradox wearing human skin, proof that the line between a husband and a killer isn't always drawn in blood. Sometimes it's drawn in silence. His interviews revealed more about human fear than about him. When he spoke, there was no dramatization, no attempt to shock. That's why it worked. He made murder sound procedural, routine, efficient. And in that efficiency, people recognized something familiar, the same detached logic that governs corporations, governments, even everyday cruelty. In his words, they heard echoes of the systems that destroy without emotion. It wasn't the magnitude of his crimes that horrified people. It was the reflection. Psychologists later described the public's obsession with Kuklinski as a form of morbid empathy. People wanted to see the limit of human coldness, to measure how far it could go. They wanted to feel safe by studying danger. But the more they listened, the less safe they felt. Because he didn't sound alien. He sounded like someone who'd simply lost the ability to care. And that's a loss anyone could imagine. It's what makes his legacy timeless. He wasn't a monster born in shadows, but one shaped by lightless rooms and unspoken pain. Barbara, his wife, never spoke publicly after his death. The children lived quiet, guarded lives, avoiding interviews, avoiding cameras. They had grown up under the shadow of a man who had lived two lives at once. They carried his name, but not his story. And perhaps that was their only rebellion, to let his memory die slowly instead of feeding it. In private, though, the echoes remained. The fear didn't disappear with his arrest. It lingered in small things. The way they locked doors, the way they measured people's moods, the way they learned to read silence as a warning. The legacy he left them wasn't money or memory. It was vigilance. In documentaries released after his death, the contrast between his calm explanations and the gravity of his crimes created a new kind of horror, one that didn't rely on screams or blood. He spoke about murder the way someone might describe mowing the lawn. I got paid. I did the job. It's just what I did. Viewers watching from their living rooms found themselves leaning closer, trying to understand how someone could be that detached. Some pitied him. Others feared him. A few, disturbingly, admired him. They saw his calm as strength, his lack of guilt as clarity. They misunderstood the lesson entirely. What his story truly revealed wasn't power. It was emptiness. The Iceman's strength wasn't a gift. It was a vacuum. His ability to kill without feeling wasn't courage. It was absence. And that absence, that hollow core, was the most terrifying thing of all. Because the world tends to worship control. It celebrates people who don't show weakness, who bury emotion, who stay composed under pressure. But taken to its extreme, that control becomes something monstrous. Richard was the endpoint of that ideal. A man so controlled that he lost connection to life itself. Law enforcement officers who'd worked the case long after his conviction often said the same thing. He was the calmest killer they'd ever met. No anger, no denial, no remorse. Just acceptance. He'd answer questions with precision, as if describing a past job. And maybe, to him, that's all it was. The chilling part was that he seemed genuinely puzzled by why anyone cared so much. People die every day, he said once. What makes mine different? It was a question with no comfort in its answer. What made his different wasn't the deaths themselves. It was the silence that followed them. In time, his image became more symbol than man. He represented a kind of fear that couldn't be fought with locks or laws. The fear that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can wear a wedding ring. It can drive a station wagon. It can mow the lawn next door. That realization changed how people thought about killers. The Iceman shattered the stereotype of the crazed lunatic. He showed that true danger can hide behind stability, that the quietest man in the room might be the one to never hear his conscience speak. His legend grew online, spreading through clips and quotes. Regret is for people who care. If there's a hell, I'll run it. Phrases that once came from a man sitting in a prison jumpsuit became cultural symbols, repeated in dark corners of the internet, stripped of their context. Young people watched his interviews, fascinated by his composure. Some treated him like an icon of toughness, misunderstanding that what they were really watching wasn't strength. It was emptiness pretending to be control. There's a reason the Iceman's story endures while others fade. It's not because of the body count or the Mafia Connection. It's because he forced people to confront something primal, the fragility of empathy. Most people live believing that conscience is permanent, that no matter what happens, something inside will stop them from crossing certain lines. Kuklinski proved that belief isn't guaranteed. When pain, pride, and power collide long enough, the ice begins to form. It starts small, an excuse, a grudge, a silence, and before long, warmth is gone. He didn't just kill people. He represented what happens when empathy dies in slow motion. Some journalists try to humanize him, suggesting that abuse made him who he was. Others argued he was born different, a biological outlier devoid of compassion from birth. But both arguments miss something deeper. The truth wasn't about nature or nurture. It was about choice. Somewhere along the line, Richard made a decision. Not all at once, but in small steps. He chose to stop caring. He chose to bury fear. He chose to see pain as proof of power. And once he made that choice enough times, it became permanent. That's the horror of his story. Not that he was a monster from birth, but that he built himself into one, brick by brick, wound by wound. The psychologists who studied him long after his death agreed on one thing. His ability to compartmentalize was absolute. It wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was identity. He didn't live one life. He lived two, side by side, without overlap. The husband and the hitman never met. When he walked through his front door, he left the corpses behind like dirty shoes. That separation was his survival mechanism. But it was also his curse. Because by dividing himself that way, he ensured that neither half ever truly lived. One side was a lie, the other a void. The lasting legacy of the Iceman isn't in what he did, it's in what he showed us. That the capacity for darkness exists in the same mind that loves, laughs, and dreams. That beneath routine, even domestic bliss, there can hide a chasm so deep that empathy never reaches it. Every time someone watches his interviews and feels the hair on their arms rise, it isn't fear of him they're feeling. It's fear of what his reflection reveals. In the end, his story became a warning disguised as fascination. The fascination lies in his calm, his precision, his certainty. The warning lies in the emptiness beneath it. He reminds us what happens when survival becomes identity, when control replaces compassion, when silence becomes morality. He reminds us that monsters don't always snarl. They sometimes smile. Years after his death, when the lights in the interview rooms have gone dark and the tapes sit archived on dusty shelves, his voice still echoes. It was just business. Simple words. But inside them lies the collapse of everything that makes a man human. Because when killing becomes business and empathy becomes inconvenience, society itself stands on thin ice. And that ice, as Richard proved, can crack without warning. His name has become a phrase, a metaphor. When people speak of someone cold, detached, or ruthless, they call him an Iceman. But they forget the cost of that title, the emptiness behind the eyes, the void that consumes everything it touches. Richard Kuklinski's life wasn't an example of strength. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when pain hardens into indifference, when silence becomes safety, and when control becomes the only thing left worth keeping. And so, as the credits of his life roll in darkness, the image that remains isn't of a killer holding a gun or a man confessing to crimes. It's the quiet stare of a man who learned to live without warmth, and in doing so, lost everything that ever made life worth living. The legacy of the Iceman is not death. It's the fear that anyone, given enough hurt and enough hate, could become just as cold. That's what keeps his story alive. Not admiration, not horror, but recognition. The silent truth that inside every human heart, the ice is always waiting to form.